their stock positions and currency positions. I wouldn't be able to tell you how they were doing. It's very, very hard to regulate when you get into very complex instruments where you've got hundreds of counterparties. The counterparty behavior and risk was a big part of why the Treasury and the Fed felt that they had to move in over a weekend at Bear Stearns. And I think they were right to do it, incidentally. Nobody knew what would be unleashed when you had thousands of counterparties with, I read someplace, contracts with a 14 trillion notional value. Those people would have tried to unwind all those contracts if there had been a bankruptcy. What that would have done to the markets, what that would have done to other counterparties in turn, it gets very, very complicated. So regulating is an important part of the system. The efficacy of it is really tough.
At Piccolo Pete's, where he has dined with everyone from Microsoft's Bill Gates to New York Yankees' Alex Rodriguez, Buffett sat at a table with 12 Whartonites and bantered over many topics. How do you feel about the election?
Way before they both filed, I told Hillary that I would support her if she ran. And I told Barack that I would support him if he ran. So I am now a political bigamist. But I feel either would be great. And actually, I feel that if a Republican wins, John McCain would be the one I would prefer. I think we've got 3 unusually good candidates this time.
They're all moderate in their approach.
Well, the one we don't know for sure about is Barack. On the other hand, he has the chance to be the most transformational, too.
I know you had a paper route. Was that your first job?
Well, I worked for my grandfather, which was really tough in the family grocery store. But if you gave me the choice of being CEO of General Electric or IBM or General Motors, you name it, or delivering papers, I would deliver papers. I would. I enjoyed doing that. I can think about what I want to think. I don't have to do anything I don't want to do. It might be wonderful to be head of GE, and Jeff Immelt is a friend of mine, and he's a great guy. But think of all the things he has to do, whether he wants to do them or not.
How do you get your ideas?
I just read. I read all day. I mean, we put $500 million in PetroChina. All I did was read the annual report. Editor's note, Berkshire purchased the shares 5 years ago and sold them in 2007 for $4 billion.
What advice would you give to someone who is not a professional investor? Where should they put their money?
Well, if they're not going to be an active investor, and very few should try to do that, then they should just stay with index funds, any low-cost indexed fund. And they should buy it over time. They're not going to be able to pick the right price and the right time. And what they want to do is avoid the wrong price and the wrong stock. You just make sure you own a piece of American business and you don't buy all at one time.
When Buffett said he was ready to pose for photographs, all 150 students stampeded out of the room within seconds and formed a massive line. For the next half hour, each one took his or her turn with Buffett, often in hammy poses. Wrestling for his wallet was a favorite. Then, as he started to leave, a 77-year-old's version of A Hard Day's Night ensued, with a pack of 30 students trailing him to his gold Cadillac. Once free, he drove this fortune writer back to his office and continued fielding questions. How does the current turmoil stack up against past crises?
Well, that's hard to say. Everyone has so many variables in it. But there's no question that this time there's extreme leveraging and, in some cases, the extreme prices of residential housing or buyouts. You've got $20 trillion of residential real estate, and you've got $11 trillion of mortgages, and a lot of that does not have a problem, but a lot of it does. In 2006, you had $330 billion of cash taken out in mortgage refinancings in the United States. That's a hell of a lot. I mean, we talk about having $150 billion of stimulus now, but that was $330 billion of stimulus. And that's just from prime mortgages. That's not from subprime mortgages. So leveraging up was one hell of a stimulus for the economy.
If that was one hell of a stimulus, do you think the $150 billion government stimulus plan will make an impact?
Well, it's $150 billion more than we'd have otherwise. But it's not like we haven't had stimulus. And then the simultaneous, more or less, LBO boom, which was called private equity this time. The abuses keep coming back, and the terms got terrible and all that. You've got a banking system that's hung up with lots of that. You've got a mortgage industry that's deleveraging, and it's going to be painful.
The scenario you're describing suggests we're a long way from turning a corner.
I think so. I mean, it seems everybody says it'll be short and shallow, but it looks like it's just the opposite. You know, deleveraging by its nature takes a lot of time, a lot of pain, and the consequences kind of roll through in different ways. Now, I don't invest a dime based on macro forecasts, so I don't think people should sell stocks because of that. I also don't think they should buy stocks because of that.
Your OFHEO example implies you're not too optimistic about regulation.
Finance has gotten so complex with so much interdependency. I argued with Alan Greenspan some about this at Washington Post Chairman Don Graham's dinner. He would say that you've spread risk throughout the world by all these instruments, and now you didn't have it all concentrated in your banks. But what you've done is you've interconnected the solvency of institutions to a degree that probably nobody anticipated, and it's very hard to evaluate. If Bear Stearns had not had a derivatives book, my guess is that the Fed wouldn't have had to do what it did.
Do you find it striking that banks keep looking into their investments and not knowing what they have?
I read a few prospectuses for residential mortgage-backed securities, mortgages, thousands of mortgages backing them, and then all those tranched into maybe 30 slices. You create a CDO by taking one of the lower tranches of that one and 50 others like it. Now, if you're going to understand that CDO, you've got 50 times 300 pages to read. It's 15,000. If you take one of the lower tranches of the CDO and take 50 of those and create a CDO squared, you're now up to 750,000 pages to read to understand one security. I mean, it can't be done. When you start buying tranches of other instruments, nobody knows what the hell they're doing. It's ridiculous. And of course, you took a lower tranche of a mortgage-backed security and did 100 of those and thought you were diversifying risk. Hell, they're all subject to the same thing. I mean, it may be a little different whether they're in California or Nebraska, but the idea that this is uncorrelated risk and therefore you can take the CDO and call the top 50% of it super senior, it isn't super senior or anything. It's a bunch of juniors all put together, and the juniors all correlate.
If big financial institutions don't seem to know what's in their portfolios, how will investors ever know when it's safe?
They can't. They can't. They've got to, in effect, try to read the DNA of the people running the companies. But I say that in any large financial organization, the CEO has to be the chief risk officer. I'm the chief risk officer at Berkshire. I think I know my limits in terms of how much I can sort of process. And the worst thing you can have is models and spreadsheets. I mean, at Solomon, they had all those models, and they fell apart.
What should we say to investors now?
The answer is you don't want investors to think that what they read today is important in terms of their investment strategy. Their investment strategy should factor in that A, If you knew what was going to happen in the economy, you still wouldn't necessarily know what was going to happen in the stock market. And B, they can't pick stocks that are better than average. Stocks are a good thing to own over time. There's only two things you can do wrong. You can buy the wrong ones, and you can buy or sell them at the wrong time. And the truth is, you never need to sell them, basically. But they could buy a cross-section of American industry, and if a cross-section of American industry doesn't work, certainly trying to pick the little beauties here and there isn't going to work either. Then they just have to worry about getting greedy. You know, I always say you should get greedy when others are fearful, and fearful when others are greedy. But that's too much to expect. Of course, you shouldn't get greedy when others get greedy, and fearful when others get fearful. At a minimum, try to stay away from that.
By your rule, now seems like a good time to be greedy. People are pretty fearful.
You're right. They are going in that direction. That's why stocks are cheaper. Stocks are a better buy today than they were a year ago, or 3 years ago.
But you're still bullish about the U.S. for the long term?
The American economy is going to do fine, but it won't do fine every year and every week and every month. I mean, if you don't believe that, forget about buying stocks anyway. But it stands to reason. I mean, we get more productive every year, you know. It's a positive-sum game, long term. And the only way an investor can get killed is by high fees or by trying to outsmart the market.
Buffett's Big Bet, June 23, 2008, by Carol Loomis. This 10-year investment performance wager runs through 2017. And at year-end 2011, the last marker before this book went to press, the two sides were virtually tied. On one side is Protégé Partners, a New York asset management firm whose success in the bet rides on the average performance, after all fees, of 5 hedge funds of funds that Protégé carefully picked to carry its colors. On the other side is Warren Buffett, who cast his lot with a low-cost S&P 500 index fund, specifically Vanguard's Admiral shares. The basic issue, obviously, is costs. Still pushing the theme laid out in Cut Your Gains, Buffett believes that the management and incentive fees charged by funds of funds and the hedge funds arrayed beneath them typically leave their investors earning less than a market index fund does. Protégé believes that its funds of funds will perform well enough to provide investors a net return, after fees, better than the market. Through 2011, neither case was doing a whit for investors. The start-off of the bet was the year from hell, 2008, when Protégé's funds fell, on the average, by 23.9%, and Buffett's Admiral shares did abysmally worse, down 37%. Buffett was then quoted in Fortune as saying, "I just hope that Aesop was right when he envisioned the tortoise overtaking the hare." And that's close to the scenario that is played out. Buffett's side, aka the tortoise, won in each of the next 3 years, and at year-end 2011 was within crawling distance of the lead. But both sides, after their horrible start, were then still down. The Protégé funds were 5.89%, and Admiral shares were 6.27%. In a sense, the only winners in this bet, at that juncture, were the managers of the funds of funds, who had been paid management fees even though their investors, their limited partners, had lost money. Ouch, said Protégé partner Ted Seeds upon hearing that summation from this writer. He did point out, however, a possible qualifier. One or more of the 5 funds of funds that contributed to the average return, a minus, could have had a positive return that would have taken their investors out of the losing camp, and perhaps have made these folks feel better about having paid a management fee. The point, though certainly relevant, is not publicly provable because, by the terms of the bet, the names of the 5 funds of funds have never been publicly disclosed. It has always been assumed, though, that one of the 5 is a fund run by Protégé. Also relevant to this discussion is the fact that, in his early days, Buffett ran a hedge fund, Buffett Partnership, and was compensated by his limited partners. But he did not take the now standard 2 and 20 route, meaning an annual 2% of assets management fee and a 20% share of profits. Instead, Buffett charged no management fee at all and stipulated that the first 6% earned on capital each year would go entirely to his limited partners. After that, he received 25% of profits. And, as noted earlier, his hedge fund put together 13 straight years of profits before he decided to shut it down. The average annual return he delivered his limited partners, after they paid Buffett his 25% take, was 23.8%. CL. Will a collection of hedge funds, carefully selected by experts, return more to investors over the next 10 years than the S&P 500? That question is now the subject of a bet between Warren Buffett, the CEO of Berkshire Hathaway, and Protégé Partners, LLC, a New York City money management firm that runs funds of hedge funds. In other words, a firm whose existence rests on its ability to put its clients' money into the best hedge funds and keep it out of the underperformers. You can guess which party is taking which side. Protégé has placed its bet on 5 funds of hedge funds, specifically the averaged returns that those vehicles deliver net of all fees, costs, and expenses. On the other side, Buffett, who has long argued that the fees that such helpers as hedge funds and funds of funds command are onerous and to be avoided, has bet that the returns from a low-cost S&P 500 index fund sold by Vanguard will beat the results delivered by the 5 funds that Protégé has selected. We're way past theory here. This bet, being reported for the first time in this article, whose author is both a longtime friend of Buffett's and editor of his chairman's letter in the Berkshire Annual Report, has been in existence since January 1st of this year. It's between Buffett, not Berkshire, and Protégé, the firm, not its funds. And there's serious money at stake. Each side put up roughly $320,000. The total funds of about $640,000 were used to buy a zero-coupon treasury bond that will be worth $1 million at the bet's conclusion. That $1 million will then go to charity. If Protégé wins, it has asked that the money be given to Absolute Return for Kids, ARK, an international philanthropy based in London. If Buffett wins, the intended recipient is Girls, Inc. of Omaha, whose board includes his daughter, Susan Buffett. And who's holding the money, by way of owning the zero-coupon bond? That's an esoteric institution most readers of this article will never have heard of, the Long Now Foundation of San Francisco, which exists to encourage long-term thinking and combat what one of its founders, Stewart Brand, of the Whole Earth Catalog, calls the pathologically short attention span that seems to afflict the world. 6 years ago, the foundation set up a mechanism for, what else? Long bets. The foundation receives wagers as donations, oversees the bets until they are decided, and then pays off the winner's designated charity. For this work, the foundation normally gets a $50 fee from each side and then shares 50-50 with the charitable winner-to-be in the returns earned on the funds being held. In the Buffett-protege bet, however, there will be no such sharing. Each side simply made a $20,000 charitable gift to the Long Now Foundation. To see today's Long Bets listings, to which the following publication of this article, The Buffett-Protege Bet, will be added, go to www.longbets.org. Some bets cataloged there sound as though they were made in sports bars. Actor Ted Danson garnered $2,000 for a charity when the Red Sox won the World Series before a U.S. men's soccer team won the World Cup. On a more cosmic front, Lotus founder Mitchell Kapor and inventor and futurist Ray Kurzweil have a $20,000 bet on the proposition that by 2029, no computer or machine intelligence will have passed the Turing test, meaning that a computer won't have successfully impersonated a human. Kapor made that prediction. Kurzweil disagrees with it. Each man, following the rules of long bets, has supported his point of view with a brief statement that is posted on the website. Buffett's and Protege's arguments will appear there as well, and follow in the sidebars below. Through 2007, the Kapor-Kurzweil bet of $20,000 was the largest on long bets. The Buffett-Protege bet obviously vaults the stakes to the stratosphere. And to that there is a certain history, which began at Berkshire's May 2006 annual meeting. Expounding that weekend on the transaction and management costs borne by investors, Buffett offered to bet any taker $1 million that over 10 years and after fees, the performance of an S&P index fund would beat 10 hedge funds that any opponent might choose. Some time later, he repeated the offer, adding that since he hadn't been taken up on the bet, he must be right in his thinking. But in July 2007, Ted Seides, a principal of Protege but speaking for himself at that point, wrote Buffett to say he'd like to make the bet, or at least some version of it. Months of sporadic negotiation ensued. The two sides eventually agreed that Seides would bet on 5 funds of funds rather than 10 hedge funds. Seides stepped way beyond his usual stakes, say the cost of a meal, suggested that he and Buffett make the bet for $100,000, which he noted was Buffett's annual salary. Buffett, not knowing then that long bets even existed, said that considering his age, he's now 77, and the complications that a 10-year bet might add to his estates being settled, he'd only be interested in wagering at least $500,000. Even then, he wrote Seides, "My estate attorney is going to think I am out of my mind for complicating things." If $500,000 seemed too steep to Seides, Buffett, for whom it's obviously more of a trifle, had no problem with Seides recruiting partners to help out. And that's what in effect happened, by way of Protege Partners LLC making the bet rather than Seides. Protege, which manages around $3.5 billion, is principally owned by Seides, 37, and 2 other men, CEO Jeffrey Tarrant, 52, and Scott Bessent, 45. Each has a strong investment background, and 2 of the 3 have worked with well-known market practitioners. Seides learned the world of alternative investments under Yale's David Swensen. Bessent worked with both George Soros and short seller Jim Chanos. Upon its founding in 2002 by Tarrant and Seides, Protege set up a fund of funds and began recruiting the kind of sophisticated investors, both institutions and wealthy individuals, who put their money in such funds. Very aware that the Securities and Exchange Commission prohibits broad-scale marketing by hedge funds and funds of funds, neither Seides nor Tarrant will disclose the precise names of the funds they now run, much less their performance records. But a London publication, InvestHedge, whose parent runs a hedge fund database, provided Fortune with several years of returns for the firm's flagship U.S. fund, Protégé Partners LP. From its inception in July 2002 through the end of 2007, the Protégé Fund gained 95% after all fees, soundly beating the Vanguard S&P 500 index fund's 64%. Protégé's performance was hugely helped by the fact that by mid-2006 the firm was extremely bearish on subprime mortgage securities, including CDOs, and had dispersed its investments in hedge funds to capitalize on that opinion. Most significant, it made an investment in Paulson & Company's hedge funds, under which John Paulson made a highly publicized killing in 2007 by short-selling securities linked to subprimes. All that's history, of course, so let's get back to the bet. Buffett and Seides agreed that they'd periodically disclose where the wager stood. Seides wanted this disclosure to take place whenever the market fell by 10%, because he believes that one of the virtues of hedge funds is their ability to weather tough times. Indeed, in the first quarter of this year, during a down market, Protégé Partners LP fell by only 1.9%, while the Vanguard fund dropped 9.5%. Buffett insisted, though, that the logical time for disclosure was at Berkshire's annual meeting every spring, and that was the final agreement. Just how much Buffett will have to say about the bet every year will be limited by one fact: the names of the 5 funds of funds that Protégé has selected are to be kept confidential. Of course, Buffett knows what the names are, because Protégé must supply him with the audited results of these funds every year. But other than that, the designated funds of funds saw no advantage, at least for now, to declaring their participation in the bet and agreed to go along only if confidentiality was promised. The first fund that Protégé tried to recruit, in fact, wouldn't sign up even then. Seides and Tarrant do have a few general things to say about the 5 funds picked. They are equity-oriented, favoring stocks over bonds, tend to invest in hedge funds that avoid in-and-out trading, and are run mostly by seasoned investment folk rather than tenderfoots. And we can probably assume that Protégé Partners LP is one of the 5, if only because its exclusion would leave the firm with the difficult job of explaining to its investors why the firm didn't care to bet on the success of its own hedge fund choices. As for the fees that investors pay in the hedge fund world, and that, of course, is the crux of Buffett's argument, they are both complicated and costly. A fund of fund normally charges a 1% annual management fee. The hedge funds it puts that money into charge an annual management fee of their own, which for funds of funds is typically 1.5%. The fees are paid quarterly by an investor and are figured on the value of his account at the time. So that's 2.5% of an investor's capital that continually goes for these fees, regardless of the returns earned during a year. In contrast, Vanguard's S&P 500 Index Fund had an expense ratio last year of 15 basis points, 0.15% for ordinary shares and only 7 basis points for Admiral shares, which are available to large investors. Admiral shares are the ones bought by Buffett in the bet. On top of the management fee, the hedge funds typically collect 20% of any gains they make. That leaves 80% for the investors. The fund of funds takes 5% or more of that 80% as its share of the gains. The upshot is that only 76% at most of the annual return made on an investor's money accrues to him, with the rest going to the helpers that Buffett has written about. Meanwhile, the investor is paying his inexorable management fee of 2.5% on capital. The summation is pretty obvious. For Protégé to win this bet, the 5 funds of funds it has picked must do better, much better, than the S&P. And maybe they will. Buffett himself assesses his chances of winning at only 60%, which he grants is less of an edge than he usually likes to have. Protégé figures its own probabilities of winning at a heady 85%. Some people will say, of course, that just by making this bet, Protégé has acquired some priceless publicity. But then, Protégé clearly wants to win, and it's up against a man who hasn't made a lot of losing bets in his life. Seides himself sees one strong ray of light. Quote, "Fortunately for us, we're betting against the S&P's performance, not Buffett's." The prediction and the arguments. Prediction. Over a 10-year period, commencing on January 1, 2008, and ending December 31, 2017, the S&P 500 will outperform a portfolio of funds of hedge funds when performance is measured on a basis net of fees, costs, and expenses. Warren Buffett, agree. A lot of very smart people set out to do better than average in securities markets. Call them active investors. Their opposites, passive investors, will by definition do about average. In aggregate, their positions will more or less approximate those of an index fund. Therefore, the balance of the universe, the active investors, must do about average as well. However, these investors will incur far greater costs. So, on balance, their aggregate results after these costs will be worse than those of the passive investors. Costs skyrocket when large annual fees, large performance fees, and active trading costs are all added to the active investor's equation. Funds of hedge funds accentuate this cost problem because their fees are superimposed on the large fees charged by the hedge funds in which the funds of funds are invested. A number of smart people are involved in running hedge funds, but to a great extent their efforts are self-neutralized, and their IQ will not overcome the costs they impose on investors. Investors, on average and over time, will do better with a low-cost index fund than with a group of funds. Protégé Partners LLC disagree. Mr. Buffett is correct in his assertion that, on average, active management in a narrowly defined universe like the S&P 500 is destined to underperform market indexes. But applying that argument to hedge funds is a bit of an apples to oranges comparison. Having the flexibility to invest both long and short, hedge funds do not set out to beat the market. Rather, they seek to generate positive returns over time regardless of the market environment. For hedge funds, success can mean outperforming the market in lean times, while underperforming in the best of times. Through a cycle, nevertheless, top hedge fund managers have surpassed market returns net of all fees while assuming less risk as well. We believe such results will continue. There is a wide gap between the returns of the best hedge funds and the average ones. This differential affords sophisticated institutional investors, among them funds of funds, an opportunity to pick strategies and managers that these investors think will outperform the averages. Funds of funds, with the ability to sort the wheat from the chaff, will earn returns that amply compensate for the extra layer of fees their clients pay. From What Obama Means for Business, July 2, 2008. An excerpt from an article by Nina Easton. Already, Obama's circle of advisors has expanded beyond a small core of academics to include veteran capitalists inside the Democratic Party. He is frequently on the phone with billionaire CEO Warren Buffett. "One of my favorite people," says Obama. "He's just completely down to earth and as smart as they come." A critic of the financial industry and of tax breaks for the rich, who also happens to understand capital markets better than just about anyone. Buffett's Market Metric Says Buy, February 16, 2009, by Carol Loomis and Doris Burke. The stock market kept going down and down in the first days of 2009, and we decided at Fortune that it just might be time to update Buffett's market metric, the relationship of the total value of U.S. stocks to GNP. We had run a chart of that metric in late 2001 in Warren Buffett on the Stock Market. The message then was a clarion, "Don't buy." But this time, when my co-author on this piece, Doris Burke, ran the numbers, they showed that the market was definitely in Buffett's buying range. So we published this article and chart in an issue that reached subscribers around February 1st. Okay, this buy signal wasn't perfect. From February 1st, the S&P 500 viciously went down another 18% before bottoming on March 9. Even so, if you'd bought an S&P 500 total return ETF on that February 1st and held until mid-year 2012, you would have earned a 78% total return and been very happy that Buffett shared this metric. CL. Is it time to buy stocks? According to both this 85-year chart and famed investor Warren Buffett, it just might be. The point of the chart is that there should be a rational relationship between the total market value of U.S. stocks and the output of the U.S. economy, its GNP. Fortune first ran a version of this chart in late 2001. Stocks had by that time retreated sharply from the manic levels of the Internet bubble. But they were still very high, with stock values at 133% of GNP. That level certainly did not suggest to Buffett that it was time to buy stocks. But he visualized a moment when purchases might make sense, saying, quote, "If the percentage relationship falls to the 70% to 80% area, buying stocks is likely to work very well for you." Well, that's where stocks were in late January, when the ratio was 75%. Nothing about that reversion to sanity surprises Buffett, who told Fortune that the shift in the ratio reminds him of investor Ben Graham's statement about the stock market. Quote, "In the short run, it's a voting machine, but in the long run, it's a weighing machine." Not just liking the chart's message in theory, Buffett also put himself on record in an October 17th New York Times op-ed piece, saying that he was personally buying U.S. stocks after a long period of owning nothing, outside of Berkshire Hathaway stock, but U.S. government bonds. He said that if prices kept falling, he expected to soon have 100% of his net worth in U.S. equities. Prices did keep falling. The Dow Jones Industrials have dropped by about 10% since October 17th. So presumably Buffett kept buying. Alas, for all curious investors, he isn't saying what he bought. From Riders on the Storm, May 4th, 2009. An excerpt from an article by Adam Lashinsky.
Warren Buffett delights in telling an anecdote about Wells Fargo's banking relationship with his own company, Berkshire Hathaway. In 2001, when Berkshire and a partner bought Finova, a bankrupt lender, it solicited banks to become part of a loan syndicate. Wells wasn't interested, says Buffett. who was Wells's largest shareholder with 315 million shares or a 7.4% stake. The others offered to lend Berkshire money at the ultra-low rate of 0.2 percentage points above its cost. A loss leader intended to win follow-on investment banking businesses from Berkshire. Not Wells. I got a big kick out of that because that's exactly how they should think, says Buffett with a hearty guffaw. The real insight you get about a banker is how they bank. Their speeches don't make any difference. It's what they do and what they don't do. And what Wells doesn't do is what defines its greatness.
Buffett Takes Charge, April 27, 2009, by Mark Gunther. The headline on this story works as a pun, but does not exactly portray Buffett's behavior when a shareholder at the Berkshire annual meeting asks about the company's 10% ownership of the Chinese car and battery company BYD. At such moments, Buffett invariably hands off the question to Charles Munger, Berkshire's vice chairman. Charlie is our expert on BYD, Buffett will say. In turn, Munger owes much of his expertise to Pasadena investment manager Li Lu, who was born in China and was a pro-democracy protester at Tiananmen Square in 1989. Berkshire made its investment of $230 million in BYD in late 2008, amid the financial crisis, at a price of about $1 per share, which is, to use the Hong Kong currency in which BYD share prices are commonly quoted, HK8. After Berkshire's entry into the picture, BYD's stock went into roller coaster mode, rising to HK77 by March 2010, and then falling to HK11 in May 2012, as prospects for electric cars worsened and BYD's profits fell. By September, the stock had risen to HK16. That price still leaves Berkshire having doubled its money, but clearly BYD has not so far prospered as Munger thought it would. Today, Munger says that he, quote, retains both great admiration for BYD's founder and CEO, Mang Chuang-fu, and high hopes for the company, yet is pessimistic about the speed of gain in sales for electric cars as a class. BYD's long-term prospects are good, Munger thinks, because the company has large and extremely modern facilities, talented employees, including many thousands of engineers, and low-cost operations that deliver products with few defects. The few defects would get an argument from some people who believe that BYD's cars are not made well. Munger, however, says that complaints about the company's products are themselves few and only a minor problem in BYD's picture. CL.
Warren Buffett is famous for his rules of investing. When a management with a reputation for brilliance tackles a business with a reputation for bad economics, it is usually the reputation of the business that remains intact. You should invest in a business that even a fool can run, because someday a fool will. And perhaps most famously, never invest in a business you cannot understand. So, when Buffett's friend and longtime partner in Berkshire Hathaway, Charlie Munger, suggested earlier this year that they invest in BYD, an obscure Chinese battery, mobile phone, and electric car company, one might have predicted Buffett would cite rule number 3 above. He is, after all, a man who shunned the booming U.S. tech industry during the 1990s. But Buffett, who is 78, was intrigued by Munger's description of the entrepreneur behind BYD, a man called Wang Chuang-fu, whom he had met through a mutual friend. This guy, Munger tells Fortune, is a combination of Thomas Edison and Jack Welch, something like Edison in solving technical problems, and something like Welch in getting done what he needs to do. I have never seen anything like it. Coming from Munger, that meant a lot. Munger, the 85-year-old vice chairman of Berkshire Hathaway, is a curmudgeon who frowns on most investment ideas. When I call Charlie with an idea, Buffett tells me, and he says, that is a really dumb idea, that means we should put 100% of our net worth into it. If he says, that is the dumbest thing I've ever heard, then you should put 50% of your net worth into it. Only if he says, I'm going to have you committed, does it mean he really doesn't like the idea. This time, Buffett asked another trusted partner, David Sokol, chairman of a Berkshire-owned utility company called Mid-American Energy, to travel to China and take a closer look at BYD. Last fall, Berkshire Hathaway bought 10% of BYD for $230 million. The deal, which is awaiting final approval from the Chinese government, didn't get much notice at the time. It was announced in late September as the global financial markets teetered on the abyss. But Buffett and Munger and Sokol think it is a very big deal indeed. They think BYD has a shot at becoming the world's largest automaker, primarily by selling electric cars, as well as a leader in the fast-growing solar power industry. Wang Xuanfu started BYD, the letters are the initials of the company's Chinese name, in 1995 in Shenzhen, China. A chemist and government researcher, Wang raised some $300,000 from relatives, rented about 2,000 square meters of space, and set out to manufacture rechargeable batteries to compete with imports from Sony and Sanyo. By about 2000, BYD had become one of the world's largest manufacturers of cell phone batteries. The company went on to design and manufacture mobile phone handsets and parts for Motorola, Nokia, Sony Ericsson, and Samsung. Wang entered the automobile business in 2003 by buying a Chinese state-owned car company that was all but defunct. He knew very little about making cars, but proved to be a quick study. In October, a BYD sedan called the F3 became the best-selling sedan in China, topping well-known brands like the Volkswagen Jetta and Toyota Corolla. BYD also began selling a plug-in electric car with a backup gasoline engine, a move putting it ahead of GM, Nissan, and Toyota. BYD's plug-in, called the F3DM for dual mode, goes farther on a single charge, 62 miles, than any other electric vehicles and sells for about $22,000, less than the plug-in Prius and much-hyped Chevy Volt are expected to cost when they hit the market in late 2010. Put simply, this little-known upstart has accelerated ahead of its much bigger rivals in the race to build an affordable electric car. Today, BYD employs 130,000 people in 11 factories, 8 in China and 1 each in India, Hungary, and Romania. Its U.S. operations are small. About 20 people work in a sales and marketing outpost in Elk Grove Village, Illinois, near Motorola, and another 20 or so in San Francisco, not far from Apple. BYD makes about 80% of Motorola's Razr handsets, as well as batteries for iPods and iPhones, and low-cost computers, including the model distributed by Nicholas Negropont's One Laptop Per Child nonprofit based in Cambridge, Mass. Revenues, which have grown by about 45% annually during the past 5 years, reached $4 billion in 2008. In acquiring a stake in BYD, Buffett broke a couple of his own rules. I don't know a thing about cell phones or batteries, he admits, and I don't know how cars work. But, he adds, Charlie Munger and David Sokol are smart guys, and they do understand it. And there's no question that what's been accomplished since 1995 at BYD is extraordinary. One more thing reassured him. Berkshire Hathaway first tried to buy 25% of BYD, but Wang turned down the offer. He wanted to be in business with Buffett to enhance his brand and open doors in the U.S., he says, but he would not let go of more than 10% of BYD's stock. This was the man who didn't want to sell his company, Buffett says. That was a good sign. We're lost in Shenzhen. I've flown 8,000 miles to meet Wang, and on the way to the interview, my driver pulls to the side of a dusty highway. He's yelling in Cantonese into his phone and frenetically sketching Chinese characters on the touchscreen of a GPS navigator. The PR woman beside me looks worried. The GPS isn't working, she says. Too many new roads. I can't blame the driver or the GPS, which, it occurs to me, was probably made nearby, since Shenzhen is the manufacturing hub of the global electronics industry, the place your cell phone, digital camera, and laptop probably came from. Just across the river from Hong Kong, Shenzhen is the biggest and fastest growing city in the world that most Americans cannot find on a map. It's also the Chinese city most like America, because people who live here have come from elsewhere in search of a better life. When Deng Xiaoping designated Shenzhen as China's first special economic zone in 1980, inviting capitalism to take root, it was a fishing village. Today, it's a sprawling megacity of 12 million to 14 million people, most of them migrant workers who toil in vast factories like those run by BYD and earn about 1,300 renminbi, or $190 per month. When we find BYD's new headquarters, a silvery office building that would not look out of place in Silicon Valley, I'm given a tour of the company museum, which celebrates products and milestones from the firm's brief history, and then escorted into a conference room where plates of apples, bananas, and cherry tomatoes are spread on a table. Wang takes a seat across from me. He is 43, a smallish man with black hair and glasses, and begins, through an interpreter, to tell me his story. He started BYD with a modest goal: to edge in on the Japanese-dominated battery business. Importing batteries from Japan was very expensive, Wang says. There were import duties and delivery times were long. He studied Sony and Sanyo patents and took apart batteries to understand how they were made, a process that involved much trial and error, he says. Sony and Sanyo later sued BYD unsuccessfully for infringing on their patents. BYD's breakthrough came when Wang decided to substitute migrant workers for machines. In place of the robotic arms used on Japanese assembling lines, which cost $100,000 or more apiece, BYD actually cut costs by hiring hundreds, then thousands of people. When I first visited the BYD factory, I was shocked, says Daniel Kim, a Merrill Lynch technology analyst based in Hong Kong, who has been to the fully automated production lines in Japan and Korea. It's a completely different business model. To control quality, BYD broke every job down into basic tasks and applied strict testing protocols. By 2002, BYD had become one of the top 4 manufacturers worldwide and the largest Chinese manufacturer in each of the 3 rechargeable battery technologies: lithium-ion, nickel-cadmium, and nickel-metal hydride, according to a Harvard Business School case study of the company. And Wang stresses that BYD, unlike Sony and Sanyo, has never faced a recall of its batteries. Deploying the armies of laborers at BYD is an office corps of managers and engineers who invent and design the products. Today, the company employs about 10,000 engineers who have graduated from the company's training programs. Some 40% of those who enter either drop out or are dismissed, and another 7,000 new college graduates are being trained. Wang says the engineers come from China's best schools. They are the top of the top, he says. They are very hardworking and they can compete with anyone. BYD can afford to hire lots of them because their salaries are only about $600 to $700 a month. They also get subsidized housing in company-owned apartment complexes and low-cost meals in BYD canteens. They're basically breathing, eating, thinking, and working at the company 24/7, says a U.S. executive who has studied BYD. Wang typically works until 11 p.m. or midnight, 5 or 6 days a week. In China, people of my generation put work first and life second, says the CEO, whose wife takes responsibility for raising their 2 children. This human resource advantage is the most important part of BYD's strategy, Wang says. His engineers investigate a wide array of technologies from automobile air conditioning systems that can run on batteries to the design of solar-powered streetlights. Unlike most automakers, BYD manufactures nearly all its cars by itself, not just the engines and body, but air conditioning, lamps, seat belts, airbags, and electronics. It is difficult for others to compete, Wang says. If we put our staff in Japan or the US, we could not afford to do anything like this. Wang himself grew up in extreme poverty. His parents, both farmers, died before he entered high school, and he was raised by an older brother and sister. The train ride from the village where he grew up to Central South Industrial University of Technology, where he earned his chemistry degree, took him by Yellow Mountain, a popular destination for hikers and tourists. But he has never visited there. I didn't go then because we had no money, he says. I don't go now because we have no time. As for accumulating wealth, I'm not interested in it, he claims. He certainly doesn't live a very lavish lifestyle. He was paid about $265,000 in 2008, and he lives in a BYD-owned apartment complex with other engineers. His only indulgences are a Mercedes and a Lexus, and they have a practical purpose. He takes their engines apart to see how they work. On a trip to the U.S., he once tried to disassemble the seat of a Toyota owned by Fred Nye, an executive who was driving him around. Shortly after BYD went public, Wang did something extraordinary. He took approximately 15% of his holdings in BYD and distributed the shares to about 20 other executives and engineers at the company. He still owns roughly 28% of the shares, worth about $1 billion. The company itself is frugal. Until recently, executives always flew coach. He once told me he was appalled that he learned that Ford, which lost billions last year, had staged a gala at the Hotel George V during the Paris Auto Show. By contrast, the last time BYD executives traveled to the Detroit Auto Show, they rented a suburban house to save the cost of hotel rooms. This attention to costs is one reason that BYD has made money consistently even as it has expanded into new businesses. Each of BYD's business units, batteries, mobile phone components, and autos, was profitable in 2008, albeit on a small scale. Overall net profits were around $187 million. BYD, which is traded on the Hong Kong Exchange, has a market value of about $3.8 billion. That's less than Ford, $7 billion at the beginning of April, but more than General Motors, $1.3 billion. Near the end of our conversation, I asked Wang about the company name. It's been reported that BYD stands for Build Your Dreams, but he says he added that as the company motto only later. Others say that as Motorola, Apple, and Berkshire Hathaway have made their way to Shenzhen, the name has taken on yet another meaning. Bring your dollars. When David Sokol toured BYD's operations last year, Wang took him to a battery factory and explained that BYD wants to make its batteries 100% recyclable. To that end, the company has developed a non-toxic electrolyte fluid. To understand the point, Wang poured battery fluid into a glass and drank it. Doesn't taste good, he said, making a face and offering a sip to Sokol. Sokol declined politely, but he got the message. His focus there was that if we're going to help solve environmental problems, We can't create new environmental problems with our technology, Sokol says. Sokol, author of a slim volume on management principles called Pleased but Not Satisfied, sized up Wang during that visit and decided he was an unusually purposeful executive. Sokol says, many good entrepreneurs can go from 0 to a couple of million in revenues and a couple of hundred people. He's got over 100,000 people. Few can do that. When he got back to the U.S., Sokol told Buffett, "This guy's amazing. You want to meet him." Even before visiting BYD, Sokol believed in electric cars. His people at Mid-American have studied clean technologies like batteries and wind power for years because of the threat of climate change. One way or another, Sokol says, energy companies will need to produce more energy while emitting less carbon dioxide. Electric cars will be one answer. They generate fewer greenhouse gas emissions than cars that burn gasoline, and they have lower fuel costs even when oil is cheap. That's because electric engines are more efficient than internal combustion engines, and because generating energy on a large scale in coal or nuclear plants is less wasteful than doing it on a small scale by burning gasoline in an internal combustion engine. The numbers look something like this. Assume you drive 12,000 miles a year. Gas costs $2 a gallon, and electricity is priced at 12 cents per kilowatt, about what most Americans pay. A gasoline-powered car that gets 20 miles to the gallon, say a Chevy Impala or a BMW X3, will have annual fuel costs of $1,200 and generate about 6.6 tons of carbon dioxide. Equip those cars with electric motors and fuel costs drop to $400 a year, and emissions are reduced to about 1.5 tons. The big problem is that they are expensive to make, and the single largest cost is the battery. Manufacturing a safe, reliable, long-lasting, and fast-charging battery for a car is a complex and costly undertaking. BYD claims to have achieved a breakthrough with its lithium-ion ferrous phosphate technology, but no one can be sure whether it will work as promised. Skeptics say that BYD's battery cannot be both more powerful and cheaper than those made by competitors, and the U.S. Department of Energy has purchased an F3DM to take the battery apart. Chitra Gopal, an analyst with Nomura Securities in Singapore who follows the company closely, says BYD is betting on entirely new technology, and the ability to produce it at scale and at low cost remains unproven. William Moore, publisher and editor-in-chief of EV World, an electric car website, says, they need to persuade people that they are selling a reliable, durable, quality automobile. Even BYD's admirers say the fit and finish of the company's cars leave much to be desired. Their cars are way behind Toyota for sure, Sokol admits. BYD currently exports gasoline-powered cars to Africa, South America, and the Middle East, but they compete on price, not quality. BYD's first plug-in hybrid, called a dual-mode car, is designed to run primarily on electricity with an internal combustion engine for backup. Two all-electric cars, the E3 and the E6, will follow later this year. Both will be sold first in China, primarily to fleet users, the government, post office, utilities, and tax companies, all of which will build central fast-charging facilities. Europe, with its high gas prices, is the most promising export market for BYD's electric cars. Wang signed an agreement last year with Autobink, a Dutch dealer group, to distribute its cars in the Netherlands and 5 Eastern European countries. The company hasn't yet decided whether it will enter the U.S. market, where the economics of electric cars are not as compelling. Sokol, who now sits on BYD's board, says BYD could instead become a battery supplier to global automakers. Some Americans, though, are eager to do business with BYD. The day after Fortune's visit to BYD, Oregon Governor Ted Kulongoski arrived to test drive an electric car and urged the company to import through the port of Portland. Meanwhile, BYD researchers are on to their next big idea, a product they call a home clean power solution. It's essentially a set of rooftop solar photovoltaic panels with batteries built in to store power for use when the sun's not out, all to be designed and manufactured by BYD. Solar is an endless source of energy, Wang says. With better technology, we can reduce the costs. Wang has also focused on building a stronger executive team to drive the company forward. The good news is he's 42 years old, Sokol says. The bad news is that he is clearly the brains behind the organization and the drive. He has to develop a team faster, but I think he knows that. Last winter, it was Sokol's turn to lead Wang on a tour of his home country. They started in Detroit, where BYD's cars generated buzz at the North American Auto Show, and wound up on the West Coast, where Wang met for the first time with Charlie Munger. In between, they stopped in Omaha. How did BYD get so far ahead? Warren Buffett asked Wang, speaking through a translator. Our company is built on technological know-how, Wang answered. Wary as always of a technology play, Buffett asked how BYD would sustain its lead. We'll never rest, Wang replied. Buffett may not understand batteries or cars, or Mandarin for that matter. Drive, however, is something that needs no translation.
From Who the Admired Admire, March 22, 2010. An excerpt from an article by Anna Bernasek. In its annual Most Admired issue, Fortune asked 6 CEOs heading admired companies to say what CEO each most admired. Ken Chenault of American Express picked Buffett, saying, "He embodies this incredible blend of high intellect and business judgment with the ability to emotionally engage with people." Buffett's Mr. Fix-It, August 16, 2010. By Brian Dumaine. No one could have imagined when we published this laudatory 2010 article about David Sokol that less than a year later he would have resigned from Berkshire and come to be seen by many in the press as a bad actor. In fact, the article, in a picture display, described him as the man mentioned most often as Buffett's successor. The other 5 Berkshire executives pictured Greg Abel of Mid-American Energy, Ajit Jain of Berkshire Reinsurance, Tad Montrose of General Ray, Tony Nicely of Geico, and Matt Rose of railroad company BNSF. Sokol abruptly removed himself as a contender in March 2011, resigning by his own choice from Berkshire and telling Buffett he'd been planning to leave for some time because he wanted to do something on his own. But the same Buffett press release that disclosed the resignation and Sokol's explanation of it also revealed that Sokol had bought stock in Lubrizol just weeks before proposing to Buffett that it would be a good company for Berkshire to buy. Buffett took care in the release to point out that Sokol had bought the stock before presenting his idea to Buffett and with no knowledge of how Buffett would react. Even so, the facts about Sokol's buying, combined with the lift in Lubrizol stock that accompanied Buffett's decision to indeed buy, put Sokol into disrepute for what some onlookers thought might be insider trading. The Berkshire press release that went out after the whole affair caused its writer, Buffett, reputational trouble as well. The release, issued March 30, 2011, is on Berkshire Hathaway's website. Much of the world thought the release was too soft on Sokol, and weirdly devoid of the outrage that Buffett had long said he would display if anyone at Berkshire lost the company a shred of reputation. Critics of Buffett also questioned why he did not bore in for information when Sokol told him at one point that he owned Lubrizol stock. The Sokol issue became not only a magnet for the press, but also topic A at Berkshire's 2011 annual meeting, held on April 30th. As one of the 3 journalists recruited to receive emailed questions from shareholders, and as the first scheduled to be at the mic, I read a question that wondered accusingly why Buffett had not reacted more harshly to what Sokol had done. Some applause followed my merely posing the question. Buffett then delivered a long answer that both called Sokol's behavior inexplicable and conceded that he himself might have handled some things better. He could have, he said specifically, asked more questions when Sokol said he owned Lubrizol stock. After the meeting, the Sokol affair largely dropped out of the news. Sokol himself moved from Omaha to the Jackson Hole, Wyoming area, where he set up an investment management business. The SEC is believed to have investigated Sokol's trading, but as of press time for this book, had brought no charges. Because the Sokol news hit very soon after Fortune had closed an issue, we did not publish a story about it in the magazine. But Brian Dumaine, who wrote the Sokol article that follows, put up a Fortune.com story about Sokol the day after Buffett's press release was issued. Brian did not use the word inexplicable, but that is what he regards Sokol's actions to have been. You can find a copy of that online story at fortune.com/BuffettBook. CL.
The day after Lehman collapsed in September 2008, David Sokol noticed that the stock of Constellation Energy, a Baltimore utility, was plummeting. He called his boss, Warren Buffett, and said, "I see an opportunity here." Buffett, who had noticed the same thing, replied after a brief discussion, "Let's go after it." Constellation held vast amounts of energy futures contracts that had gone sour, and the company appeared to be on the verge of bankruptcy. Sokol, as chairman of the Berkshire subsidiary Mid-American Energy Holdings, knew the utility industry and saw a chance to buy solid assets at a bargain price. The deal, however, had to be done within 48 hours, or the company would have to file for bankruptcy. Sokol phoned the office of Constellation CEO Mayo Shattuck III, who was in an emergency board meeting. When his assistant answered, Sokol told her he'd like to speak to him. The secretary replied that if she interrupted the meeting, she might lose her job. Sokol replied, "If you don't interrupt the meeting, you might lose your job." Sokol boarded a Falcon 50EX and sped to Baltimore. He met with Shattuck and struck a deal that evening to buy the company for $4.7 billion, staving off bankruptcy. Within weeks, before the acquisition was completed, Constellation's board received a competing bid from Électricité de France for about a 30% premium. The board liked the offer, and so did Sokol, who walked away with a $1.2 billion breakup fee for Berkshire. When investors think of Berkshire Hathaway, they of course think of Warren Buffett and his record as a hands-off, if highly attentive, CEO. He gives free rein to the heads of his large collection of companies, ranging from Geico to Dairy Queen to Benjamin Moore to the Buffalo News to NetJets. Yet, even in Buffett's empire, sometimes a CEO blows it, and his business needs to be fixed or a deal needs to get done fast. When that happens, Buffett's go-to guy is David Sokol. Of all Berkshire's lieutenants, Sokol, 53, is mentioned most often as Buffett's heir, although Sokol shrugs off such speculation. Buffett likes Sokol just where he is, getting deals done, boosting profits, and turning around ailing businesses. In the foreword to Sokol's book, Pleased but Not Satisfied, Buffett writes, "He brings the business equivalent of Ted Williams's .406 batting average to the field of business management." Buffett first met Sokol in 1999 when Berkshire was buying Mid-American, the Iowa utility. With longtime Buffett friend Walter Scott, Sokol had bought a small $28 million a year geothermal business in 1991 and built it into that utility powerhouse. Mid-American, headquartered in Des Moines, now represents an $11.4 billion slice of Berkshire's revenue, about 10%, and Sokol is its chairman. In 2007, Buffett asked Sokol to get Johns Manville, an underperforming roofing and insulation company, on track, and he did. He is now its chairman. In 2008, Charlie Munger, Buffett's vice chairman, asked Sokol to fly to China to conduct due diligence on BYD, a battery and electric car maker. Sokol liked what he saw, and Berkshire invested $230 million for 10% of the company. That stake is now worth around $1.8 billion. In April, when Buffett had concerns about a provision in the Senate financial regulation bill that would have required Berkshire and other companies to post billions of collateral on their existing derivatives, it was Sokol he sent to argue his case. Buffett's side of the argument won. Last summer, Buffett handed Sokol perhaps the biggest assignment of his career, turning around NetJets. The fractional ownership jet company last year lost $711 million before taxes. Not the kind of performance that warms Buffett's heart. Today, the company is profitable, and Fortune got a rare, exclusive view of how Sokol did it. But more on that later. It's not hard to understand why Buffett likes this driven Midwesterner. Sokol complements his skills, while Buffett comes off as your favorite uncle, relaxed with a warm sense of humor. Sokol is always revving in high gear. An engineer by training, he is a tough, no-nonsense manager. He's up before 5 a.m. each day and jogs 5 miles and lifts weights 5 days a week, in part to keep his weight down, but also to survive a grueling schedule. He's on the road half the year, not counting the shuttling between his homes in Omaha and in Columbus, where NetJets is based. He and his wife, Peggy, have a grown daughter, Kelly. In his rare time off, he likes to fish and ski. He gets more done in a day, says Buffett, than probably I get done in a week, and I'm not kidding. Sokol has been richly rewarded for his hard work. He, Walter Scott, and Greg Abel, now CEO of Mid-American, together owned, not in equal shares, a 19% chunk of that company worth about $300 million when Berkshire acquired the utility in 2000. On any given day, Sokol might be out rubbing shoulders with his employees or spending time with customers and business partners, looking for new opportunities in China, Brazil, Germany, or elsewhere. How can he spend so much time out of the office and still run 3 major businesses? Sokol has a formula, one that is laid out in Pleased but Not Satisfied. He hands out the self-published book to all his executives. The concise 129-page treatise expounds Sokol's 6 laws: operational excellence, integrity, customer commitment, employee commitment, financial strength, and environmental respect. Yes, they are management bromides, but Sokol drives them so hard and so consistently into every organization he touches, ruthlessly if need be, that time and again they get him the kind of results even a Warren Buffett could like. Another trick to running 3 businesses at once, Sokol says, is to hire first-class executive assistants and use them aggressively. Too many people use assistants just to make phone calls, type letters, and file, he says. At most, mine do that a third of the time. He has 2 full-time assistants and 1 part-timer who, he says, know how I think. They give him an update once a week on all the goals he set for his businesses and for the executives who run them. His assistants also know he never likes to be late for a meeting. He believes it shows disrespect. They always build in extra time in case something goes wrong, but they also make sure he has work to do if he happens to show up a half hour early. Sokol's childhood offered little evidence that he would one day become a big success. He grew up in Omaha in what he calls the wrong side of town. At the University of Nebraska, he wanted to be a doctor, but the first time he saw a cadaver, he fainted and hit his head on the edge of a marble table. His father gently suggested that he follow in the footsteps of his older brother and study civil engineering. In 1982, 4 years after graduating, he was hired by Citicorp in New York City, where he advised clients on investing in big waste energy projects. He was soon lured away to run a waste energy business called Ogden Martin, which he built into a New York Stock Exchange company before joining Walter Scott at what was to become Mid-American. Sokol's record is not unblemished. Even if you bat .406, you strike out sometimes. And what he now says was probably the biggest failure of his career. Sokol, in the early 2000s, decided to invest in a new method to remove zinc from one of Mid-American's geothermal wells in California. The technology worked in the lab, but when applied in the field, it flopped, leaving Mid-American with a $2 million loss. In retrospect, Sokol should have done more pilot testing. The worst mistake I made, he says, was that when I approved the project, in the pit of my stomach, I knew it was a mistake. I've tried to teach this to young executives ever since. Your gut instincts are extremely important to listen to, particularly when they are telling you not to do something. When he reported the bad news to Buffett, the boss simply said, "Don't make a habit of it." Sokol got stung again last April when an Omaha judge issued a $32 million ruling against Mid-American, finding that the company had willfully and intentionally miscalculated future profits to force out minority stockholders in a hydropower project in the Philippines in the 1990s. Sokol strongly disagrees with the ruling, and the company is appealing. Such setbacks notwithstanding, Sokol is the Mr. Fix-It Buffett sends in when some parts of the Berkshire machine breaks down. What's it like when David Sokol parachutes in? Consider the NetJets story. In mid-August 2009, NetJets was losing money and customers. Founder and CEO Rich Santulli drafted a letter of resignation, and Buffett accepted it. The situation was painful for both men. Buffett liked Santulli as a friend, and in the 2003 Berkshire Annual Report, he had described him as an extraordinary CEO. An ex-Goldman Sachs banker, Santulli had created a fractional jet ownership industry in 1986. By 2009, NetJets had 842 aircraft, 3,500 pilots, and revenue of $3.1 billion. Santulli, who signed a non-disparagement agreement, chose not to comment for this article. Santulli came up with the notion of fractional ownership when he noticed that most owners use their jets only a couple of hundred hours a year. Why not split the heavy cost of ownership, he thought, and at the same time avoid the hassles of hiring pilots and maintaining the plane? Today, a NetJets customer typically buys a 1/8 share of a jet for, say, 5 years. He also pays around $5,000 an hour for operations. Because NetJets has a huge fleet, it can guarantee an owner a plane not necessarily his own, but an identical model, with only 4 hours' notice. Buffett and his family and many Berkshire executives have long been happy NetJets customers. Buffett is so fond of the company, he likes to peddle the service to Berkshire shareholders at his annual meetings, where he sometimes puts jets on display. In his 2001 report, Buffett, whose company also owns Fruit of the Loom, wrote, "If you buy a fraction of a plane, we might even throw in a 3-pack of briefs or boxers." Yet, since Buffett bought NetJets from the entrepreneur in 1998 for $725 million, it has not come close to earning back Berkshire's investment. The fractional jet business is like running an airline, only exponentially more complicated. Imagine having to fly a customer to a destination on 4 hours' notice. Not only does the jet need to be available, but the pilots, flight attendants, maintenance crew, and catering services all have to be at the right place at the right time. NetJets spends $100 million a year alone on pilot training. Headquarters in Columbus has its own staff of meteorologists to track weather that might delay flights. And NetJets' well-heeled customers are used to getting what they want. One G5 owner drank his coffee only out of a white styrofoam cup, and crews would have to scramble to find the cups and put them next to his seat. A NetJets pilot recalls flying a passenger from Denver to LA for a haircut and then returning him to Denver. The passenger was a poodle. The flights cost $32,000. By August of last year, the financial meltdown had taken its toll on NetJets. Some top executives no longer wanted to be seen climbing into a $50 million Gulfstream. Those Detroit CEOs flying on private jets to the congressional bailout hearings didn't help. Others couldn't afford it. The NetJets contract guarantees buying back an owner's share at a fair market price. Squeezed Wall Street titans couldn't sell their houses, their art, or their horses. But they did have a guarantee that Berkshire would buy back their jets. Owners started selling shares back at a level that was unprecedented. One NetJets executive there at the time says, "We were looking into the precipice. The charts looked like the Superman roller coaster at Six Flags." NetJets was left holding on its books a large number of unsold aircraft worth, in some cases, 40% less than had been paid for them. As the situation worsened, Sokol replaced Santulli as CEO. When he had flown to NetJets' Columbus headquarters in early August to check things out, Sokol discovered two major problems with the company. First, it had bought too many new planes, causing its debt to skyrocket. Second, NetJets' management, according to Sokol, was too informally organized to be effective. Sokol began handing out copies of his management book. Before long, he realized that fixing NetJets was going to be far harder than he had imagined. Over the last quarter of a century, Santulli, a charismatic leader, had built a strong culture at NetJets. Many employees felt like family, willing to go the extra mile to make sure this complex business worked out day in and day out. If you needed help, you got it. Employees filled in for one another. Sokol's challenge was to radically change NetJets without ruining the esprit de corps that defined the company. But top management liked things just the way they were. At meetings, Sokol would propose selling planes or cutting costs, and executives would push back. Before long, Sokol grew frustrated. Says Bill Olson, who was at the time running NetJets' aviation and operating division, it was no secret that David was not open to suggestions, critical debate, or constructive criticism. Once you challenged him in a meeting, he'd give you a look to kill, and you'd fall very fast out of his favor. Olson left management and went back to being a NetJets pilot. Sokol responds, "That's just not true. My management style is collaborative." Despite the blowback, Sokol pushed ahead, canceling orders for new planes, selling off old ones, and reducing debt from $1.9 billion to $1.3 billion. He also cut some $100 million in costs, enough to make operations profitable. He started with low-hanging fruit. About $30 million of cost savings came from canceling the free use of airplanes. The old regime often let a movie star, singer, or friend of the company have free rides or upgrades for promotional purposes. Says Sokol, "We might have been getting only $2 or $3 million in value for $30 million in costs on such promotions." Sokol also cut out an expensive Las Vegas poker tournament that the company put on each year for its clients. Next came layoffs. Santulli had already reduced headcount by about 4%. Sokol laid off another 5% and furloughed some 500 pilots, bringing the total headcount to 6,400. He says that because NetJets was flying fewer planes, the company didn't need as many employees. Many top managers disagreed fiercely with the depth of the cuts. arguing that service would suffer. Before long, about half the senior management team had been let go. The rest were reassigned or left on their own. Sokol argues that the company was long overdue for a shakeup. One thing that can be very nice in a dysfunctional management is that it's very hard to measure people, he says. So you have managers who are patting themselves on the back, saying they're doing great, while the reality is that there's no way to measure what they're doing. One NetJets executive whose sales region was losing money still received multi-million-dollar bonuses. Having purged senior management, Sokol elevated 3 NetJets executives from the next rung down to his new team and hired 3 from the outside. Says he, NetJets was top-heavy and lacked a good organizational structure. We needed to give employees responsibilities and goals that were clear and deliverable. We needed to make clear who was doing what. Under the old regime, service and costs had been measured to some extent, but not broadly throughout the organization. Explains Bill No, a longtime employee whom Sokol elevated to president of NetJets North America. In the old regime, you got everyone in top management in a room and said, here's our goal, here's what we're doing. But did the employee on the second floor of accounts receivable know what was going on? Probably not. Sokol has trained his team to measure every single thing the company does, from on-schedule service to bill collection to the quality of catering. When we make a mistake, he says, we analyze why we made the mistake, and if there's a way to fix it, we fix it by putting a system in place that solves the problem. Recently, a NetJets customer who was landing at a small private airfield in Fort Lauderdale said he needed a rental car at Fort Lauderdale International. His mistake, but the NetJets service rep didn't pick it up. Sokol's team has since adjusted the software system, so the service rep can't make that car reservation without the computer system pointing out that the car and airport don't match. Says he, in less than 0.5% of our flights do we make a mistake in making a reservation. If it's 0.5%, it's still too many. Sokol has also brought customer service, sales, and marketing into one group, creating cross-functional teams that are much more familiar with an owner's needs. The service people, who are often in the field meeting and greeting owners, might find out that Mr. X likes caviar and Coke Zero and add that information to a master file the company keeps on each customer. Says Adam Johnson, NetJets Senior Vice President. Just knowing the owner, knowing anniversaries and birthdays, helps to build strong relationships. The old entrepreneurial NetJets culture, says Sokol, focused on immediate growth rather than long-term planning. He instituted a rigorous 5- and 10-year planning process that looks at everything from future demand for new planes to jet fuel prices, inflation, and new markets like China. Says Jordan Hansel, NetJets General Counsel, you lay out a whole series of explicit assumptions about the economy, business planning, regulations. That forces you to ask yourself, what are the important factors that make you change some decisions? It helps reduce surprises. One thing that did surprise Sokol was the venom with which some ex-NetJets managers have been waging a war of words against him, partly on Buffett biographer Alice Schroeder's website. Jim Jacobs, the co-founder of NetJets, is one of the harshest critics. Jacobs, who left his position as vice chairman in January, argues that Sokol's cost-cutting is sacrificing service, and that owners are complaining and many are leaving. He also claims that canceling orders for new planes is a big mistake. Says he, we were protecting the franchise value and the ability of the golden goose to keep laying eggs. We didn't panic and lay off pilots who cost a fortune to bring back on. We didn't cancel new planes to let our fleet get older and thus more expensive to run. We didn't shut down our influencer network. No one at NetJets now has a clue how to run it. Criticizing the staff cuts, Jacobs points out that most of the $711 million loss in 2009 was a non-cash charge and says the company was headed toward being about $70 million cash flow positive in 2010, even if the company didn't sell another new fractional share. The cuts, he argues, have made NetJets a tiny shadow of what it was. Ludicrous, Sokol snaps back. And all the acquisitions and business turnarounds I've done, I've never seen senior people leave a company who then go out and try to spread rumors and call customers and try to be harmful to the business. It's a horrible thing to see, because the only people they are hurting are themselves and the employees of the company. The judgment that matters here, of course, is Buffett's, and he is pleased and satisfied. Dave is now making very good money, and not from selling planes, Buffett says. It looks like NetJets will earn $200 million pre-tax this year. It's as remarkable a managerial achievement as I have ever seen. When aviation picks up, it could be a company that could earn $500 million a year. Sokol feels that his turnaround is largely done. He hopes to elevate one of the 6 in his new management team to CEO, perhaps by the end of the year. The question now is, when the phone rings again from Omaha, where will he fly off to next?
The Giving Pledge. In June 2010, almost exactly 4 years after Warren Buffett announced his huge gift to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and 4 other foundations, he and the Gateses returned momentously to the philanthropic scene with their announcement of the Giving Pledge, their drive to expand the thinking of billionaires about how much of their fortunes to give away to charity. Fortune did this cover article breaking the news. Attached to it was Buffett's personal pledge, which was simultaneously posted on the Giving Pledge's brand new website. 3 months before this pledge news was announced, and even before there was certainty as to how and when it would be, Bill Gates and Warren Buffett met for lunch near the Omaha airport to discuss the venture, which at that point lacked even a name. I knew a little about their plan to meet and thought it presented a photo op apt to be important. My managing editor, Andy Serwer, agreed when I told him about the philanthropic milestone in the making. And so it was that when we published the cover story in June, we had a lead-off shot of Warren and Bill eating lunch at a Hollywood diner outside Omaha that March, with Bill on a recess from a cross-country flight and Warren having driven himself from his office in the city. As of September 2012, there were 92 signers of the Giving Pledge, not including their co-signing spouses. Considering that a much larger collection of the very rich, namely the Forbes 400, were the targets Buffett and the Gateses had in mind, there are still plenty of prospects. But Buffett, for one, believes that the crowd already signed up makes the Giving Pledge a real success. Quote, I would have defined success as a lot less than 92, he says, and I know that we have changed the minds of some people about how much to give, in a couple of cases by a lot. Furthermore, Buffett and Gates have organized and attended dinners in India and China that have spread the idea of the Giving Pledge to lands where philanthropy usually finishes a poor second to dynastic inheritances. The India dinner, in March 2011, attracted scores of business people and government officials. So there is no telling at this point how far the Giving Pledge philosophy can be extended. C.L. The $600 Billion Challenge, July 5, 2010, by Carol Loomis. Just over a year ago, in May 2009, word leaked to the press that the 2 richest men in America, Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, had organized and presided over a confidential dinner meeting of billionaires in New York City. David Rockefeller was said to have been a host, Mayor Michael Bloomberg and Oprah Winfrey to have been among those attending, and philanthropy to have been the main subject. Pushed by the press to explain, Buffett and Gates declined. but that certainly didn't dim the media's interest in reaching for descriptions of the meeting. The Chronicle of Philanthropy called it unprecedented. Both ABC News and the Houston Chronicle went for clandestine. A New York Magazine parody gleefully imagined George Soros to have been starstruck in the presence of Oprah. One radio broadcaster painted a dark picture. "Ladies and gentlemen, there's mischief afoot, and it does not bode well for the rest of us." "No, no," rebutted the former CEO of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Patty Stonecipher, who had been at the meeting and had reluctantly emerged to combat the rumors. The event, she told the Seattle Times, was simply a group of friends and colleagues discussing ideas about philanthropy. And so it was. But that discussion, to be fully described for the first time in this article, has the potential to dramatically change the philanthropic behavior of Americans, inducing them to step up the amounts they give. With that dinner meeting, Gates and Buffett started what can be called the biggest fundraising drive in history. They'd welcome donors of any kind, but their direct target is billionaires, whom the two men wish to see greatly raise the amounts they give to charities, of any and all kinds. That wish was not mathematically framed at the time of the New York meeting. But as two other U.S. dinners were held, though not leaked, Buffett and Gates and his wife Melinda set the goal. They are driving to get the super rich, starting with the Forbes list of the 400 wealthiest Americans, to pledge, literally pledge, at least 50% of their net worth to charity during their lifetimes or at death. Without a doubt, that plan could create a colossal jump in the dollars going to philanthropy, though of what size is a puzzle we'll get to. To begin with, a word about this article you are reading. It is the first public disclosure of what Buffett and Melinda and Bill Gates are trying to do. Over the past couple of months, Fortune has interviewed the three principals as the project has unfolded, as well as a group of billionaires who have signed up to add their names to the Gates-Buffett campaign. In a sense, this article is also an echo of two other Fortune stories, both featuring Buffett on the cover. The first, published in 1986, was "Should You Leave It All to the Children?" To that query, Buffett emphatically said no. The second article, which appeared in 2006, disclosed Buffett's intention to gradually give away his Berkshire Hathaway fortune to 5 foundations, chief among them the world's largest, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. For Buffett's thinking on the disposition of his wealth, see his pledge that follows this article. Since then, in 4 years of contributions, Buffett has given the foundation $6.4 billion, not counting the 2010 gift to be made this summer. The foundation, in turn, has in that same period combined Buffett's money and its immense gifts from the Gateses to raise its level of giving to about $3 billion a year, much of it for world health. One small example, the Medicines for Malaria venture, heavily funded by the Gates Foundation, has worked with pharmaceutical company Novartis to develop good-tasting malaria pills and distribute them to millions of children, the principal victims of the disease, in 24 countries. Another fact about the 2006 Buffett article is that it was written by yours truly, Carol Loomis, a senior editor-at-large of Fortune. Besides that, I am a longtime friend of Buffett's and editor of his annual letter to Berkshire's shareholders. Through him, my husband John Loomis and I have also come to know Melinda and Bill Gates socially. The Loomis team has even occasionally played bridge against Warren and Bill. All that said, the question of what philanthropy might gain from the Gates-Buffett drive rests, at its outset, on a mystery: what the wealthiest Americans are giving now. Most of them aren't telling, and outsiders can't pierce the veil. For that matter, the Forbes 400 list, while a valiant try, is a best guess estimate both as to the cast of characters and as to their net worth. Buffett says he knows of 2 Berkshire shareholders who should be on the list but have been missed. As Bill Gates sums it up, the list is imprecise. Those qualifiers noted, the magazine stated the 2000 net worth of the Forbes 400 to be around $1.2 trillion. So if those 400 were to give 50% of that net worth away during their lifetimes or at death, that would be $600 billion. You can think of that colossal amount as what the Buffett and Gates team is stalking, at a minimum. Leaving aside the Forbes 400 and looking simply at Internal Revenue Service data for both annual giving and estate taxes, we can piece together a picture of how far the very rich might be from a figure like that $600 billion. Start with an admirable fact about Americans as a whole. The U.S. outdoes all other countries in philanthropic generosity, annually giving in the neighborhood of $300 billion. Some of that gets reported as charitable deductions on the tax filings made by individuals. But taxpayers at low income levels don't tend to itemize, taking the standard deduction instead. At higher income levels, charitable gift data begin to mean something. To take one example for 2007, the latest data available. The 18,394 individual taxpayers having adjusted gross income of $10 million or more reported charitable gifts equal to about $32.8 billion, or 5.84% of their $562 billion in income. And billionaires? Here, the best picture, though it's flawed, emerges from statistics that the IRS has for almost 2 decades been releasing on each year's 400 largest individual taxpayers, a changing universe, obviously. The decision of the government to track this particular number of citizens may or may not have been spurred by the annual publication of the Forbes list. In any case, the 2 400 batches, though surely overlapping, cannot be identical. For one reason, because the IRS data deal with income, not net worth. The IRS facts for 2007 show that the 400 biggest taxpayers had a total adjusted income of $138 billion, and just over $11 billion was taken as a charitable deduction, a proportion of about 8%. The amount deducted, we need quickly to add, must be adjusted upward because it would have been limited for certain gifts. Among them very large ones, such as Buffett's $1.8 billion donation that year to the Gates Foundation. Even so, it is hard to imagine the $11 billion rising, by any means, to more than $15 billion. If we accept $15 billion as a reasonable estimate, that would mean that the 400 biggest taxpayers gave 11% of their income to charity, just a bit more than tithing. Is it possible that annual giving misses the bigger picture? One could imagine that the very rich build their net worth during their lifetimes and then put large charitable bequests into their wills. Estate tax data, unfortunately, make hash of that scenario, as 2008 statistics show. The number of taxpayers making estate tax filings that year was 38,000. And these filers had gross estates totaling $229 billion. 4/5 of those taxpayers made no charitable bequests at death. The 7,214 who did make bequests gave $28 billion. And that's only 12% of the $229 billion gross estate value posted by the entire 38,000. All told, the data suggest that there is a huge gap between what the very rich are giving now and what the Gateses and Buffett would like to suggest is appropriate, that 50% or better of net worth. The question is how many people of wealth will buy their argument. The seminal event in this campaign was that billionaires' gathering in May 2009, the First Supper, if you will. The Gateses credit Buffett with the basic idea that a small group of dedicated philanthropists be somehow assembled to discuss strategies for spreading the gospel to others. The Gateses proceeded to arrange the event. Bill Gates says with a grin, "If you had to depend on Warren to organize this dinner, it might never have happened." In his office, meanwhile, Buffett scrawled out a name for a new file: Great Givers. The first item filed was a copy of a March 4th letter that Buffett and Gates sent to the patriarch of philanthropy, David Rockefeller, to ask that he host the meeting. Rockefeller, now 95, told Fortune that the request was a surprise, but a pleasure. As a site for the event, he picked the elegant and very private President's House at Rockefeller University in New York City, whose board he has been on for 70 years. He also tapped his son David Jr., 68, to go with him to the meeting. The event was scheduled for 3 p.m. on Tuesday, May 5th, a day urgently desired by Bill Gates, who wanted to fit the meeting into a short U.S. break he'd be taking from a 3-month European stay with his family. Because Melinda elected to remain in Europe with their 3 children, she did not attend the first dinner, but lined herself up for any that followed. The Gateses have considered this campaign to be a personal matter for them, not in any way a project of the Gates Foundation. Melinda also insisted from the start that both husbands and wives be invited to the dinners, sure that both would be important to any discussion. Her reasoning, quote, "Even if he's the one that made the money, she's going to be a real gatekeeper. And she's got to go along with any philanthropic plan because it affects her and it affects their kids." The letter of invitation, dated March 24th, went to more people than could come. But the hosts and guests who arrived on May 5th certainly had enough economic tickets to be there. A combined net worth of maybe $130 billion, and a serious history of having depleted that amount by giving money to charity. Leaving aside the semi-observers, Patty Stonecipher and David Rockefeller, Jr., there were 14 people present, starting with the senior Rockefeller, Buffett, and Gates. The local guests included Mayor Bloomberg, 3 Wall Streeters, Pete Peterson, Julian Robertson, and George Soros, and Charles Chuck Feeney, who made his money as a major owner of duty-free shoppers and has so far given away $5 billion through his foundations, called Atlantic Philanthropies. When Feeney was dropped from the Forbes 400 in 1997, the magazine explained his departure in words not often hauled out for use, quote, "gave bulk of holdings to charity." The out-of-towners included Oprah, Ted Turner, and 2 California couples, Los Angeles philanthropists Eli and Edith Broad, and Silicon Valley's John and Taisha Morgridge, whose fortune came from Cisco Systems. Both the Broads and the Morgridges had equivocated over whether to accept the invitation, regarding the trip as an inconvenience. But there were the signatures at the bottom of the letter, from left to right: Rockefeller, Gates, Buffett. Impressive, Eli Broad thought. So on the appointed day, the Broads found themselves seated with everyone else around a big conference table, wondering what came next. They mainly got that message from Buffett, whose quick sense of humor left him playing, says David Rockefeller Jr., quote, "the enlivener role." He remembers Buffett as keeping the event from being too somber and too self-congratulatory. Buffett set the ball rolling by talking about philanthropy, describing the meeting as exploratory, and then asking each person, going around the table, to describe his or her philosophy of giving and how it had evolved. The result was 12 stories, each taking around 15 minutes, for a total of nearly 3 hours. But most participants whom Fortune had talked to found the stories riveting, even when they were familiar. David Rockefeller Sr. described learning philanthropy at the knees of his father and grandfather. Ted Turner repeated the oft-told tale of how he had made a spur-of-the-moment decision to give $1 billion to the United Nations. Some people talked about the emotional difficulty of making the leap from small giving to large. Others worried that their robust philanthropy might alienate their children. Later, recalling the meeting, Buffett laughed that it had made him feel like a psychiatrist. The charitable causes discussed in those stories covered the spectrum: education, again and again, culture, hospitals and health, the environment, public policy, the poor generally. Bill Gates, who found the whole event amazing, regarded the range of causes as admirable. Quote, "The diversity of American giving," he says, "is part of its beauty." At the dinner that followed, the conversation turned specifically to how giving by the rich could be increased. The ideas advanced included national recognition of great philanthropists, presidential medals, for example, or a film, or a philanthropy guidebook, or a conference of the rich. There was no talk of a pledge. Of the dinner, the junior Rockefeller says, "The most important thing my dad and I came away with was that increasing giving would take work by many in that room, delicate and probably prolonged one-on-one work." The dinner, of course, had its unexpected coda: the leak. The leaker, with little doubt, was Chuck Feeney, and the leakee was his longtime friend Niall O'Dowd, the New York publisher behind the grandly unknown IrishCentral.com. Fortune did not succeed in reaching Feeney. Of our account, O'Dowd said, "I can't confirm that." On May 18, 2 weeks after the meeting, IrishCentral.com posted an article of 14 short paragraphs headlined, "Secret Meeting of World's Richest People Held in New York." With that, the fame of the website spiked, as the rest of the press picked up the news and ran with it. The Irish Central article exhibited some confusion about which Rockefeller starred at the dinner, or was even there, but otherwise provided the names of all the participants, with the notable exception of Feeney, who apparently didn't realize he looked more conspicuous to the others by being left out. Feeney, however, appears to have been quoted anonymously in the piece, once as an attendee who thought Gates the most impressive speaker of the day, Turner the most outspoken, surprise, and Buffett the most insistent on his agenda for change. In a second instance, Feeney was a good bet to have been the odd participant who extolled his fellow guests. They were all there, the great and the good. The main effect of the leak was to place a cone of silence, that's a description from the Gates camp, over everything that transpired in the giving campaign over the next year. But there was certainly action, including a few small dinners abroad. Bill and Melinda Gates hosted a dinner in London, and Bill held a few others in India and China. Raising the philanthropic bar in foreign countries is a special challenge. Dynastic wealth is widely taken for granted. Tax laws do not commonly allow deductions for gifts to charity. A paucity of institutions and organizations ready for gifts makes knowing whom to give to just not that obvious. Nonetheless, were the Gateses and Buffett to succeed in their campaign in the U.S., they would probably take it overseas. But as last summer and fall progressed, Buffett and the Gateses did not even have a plan for how the campaign was to be structured. In this vacuum, the idea of a pledge took hold and gained strength. It helped that more dinners were to be held. At them, says Melinda, the three principals would float the pledge idea to see if it would fly. There then occurred the second and third U.S. dinners, most of whose guests have not been publicly outed because of the cone of silence. Secrecy, a Gates spokesman says, is partly about two moguls who have been exposed to the philanthropic sales pitch, but would be embarrassed to have been identified in case they chose not to step up to the challenge. In any event, the names of some of the participants are known. The noted philanthropists at the second dinner held at the New York Public Library in November last year included New York investment banker Kenneth Langone and his wife Elaine, and H.F. Jerry Lenfest and his wife Marguerite from Philadelphia. Lenfest got rich when he sold his Pennsylvania cable television company to Comcast in 2000, netting $1.2 billion for himself and his family. He promptly vowed that he would give most of it to charity in his lifetime. Now 80, he has so far meted out $800 million, a good part of it to schools he attended: Columbia Law School, Washington and Lee, Mercersburg Academy. Lenfest's favorite moment at the November dinner was Buffett's declaration that Marguerite Lenfest had put forward the best idea of the evening when she said that the rich should sit down, decide how much money they and their progeny need, and figure out what to do with the rest of it. Says Lenfest, the value of Buffett and Gates is that they're going to make people sit down and think these things through. The third supper, held in December in Menlo Park, California at the Rosewood Sand Hill Hotel, is known as the Bay Area Dinner, but drew from all over the state, including its entertainment precincts. In attendance were some veteran philanthropists, including venture capitalist John Doerr of Kleiner Perkins and his wife Anne, and the Mortgages, who had selected the meeting site. This dinner was somewhat different from the other two, says Melinda Gates, because a few people there were relatively new to huge wealth and were still forming their opinions about giving. Talk went on for hours, so long that the beef being prepared for dinner became somewhat overcooked. This is reported to have dismayed Rosewood's management, which may have noticed that the crowd in the Dogwood Room was worth having back. The dinner also brought out some of the fears that people have about philanthropy. What does going public with big gifts do to the peace in your life? Won't pleas from charities be unending? How do you deal with giving internationally, which too often seems like throwing money down a hole? These are valid concerns, say the Gateses, the kind raised by people who want to feel as smart about giving as they were about making their money. But the questions didn't stop the two from plugging the satisfactions of philanthropy. At those dinners, says Bill, no one ever said to me, "We gave more than we should have." Nor did the idea of a pledge get shot down at those dinners. It, quote, floated nicely, in other words. So as 2010 arrived, a pledge became the strategy. The idea of aiming for a 50% slice of net worth was pragmatically pulled from the sky, being less than the principals would have liked to ask for, but perhaps as much, at least initially, as they can get. The pledges, meanwhile, were never envisioned as legal contracts, but rather moral obligations to be both memorialized in writing and taken very seriously. They are, in fact, to be posted on a new website, givingpledge.org, whose construction Melinda Gates oversaw. The 99% pledge that Buffett is making is likely to be the #1 document on the website, if he is not beaten out by his Seattle friends. Enthusiastic about leading the search for great givers, the Gateses and Buffett nonetheless have wanted a phalanx of strong supporters. Already committed to at least a 50% pledge are the Broads, the Doers, the Lenfests, and the Mortgages. With the online publication of this article, moreover, the three principals will send emails and make calls to other billionaires judged likely prospects. A bit later, all of the pledgers may join in sending a letter to a large number of other billionaires, asking them to join the growing crowd. In the fall, there may even be a Great Givers Conference. The definition of success in this venture may take years to figure out, but each of the principles has reflections about the matter. Buffett knows that everyone rich has thought about what to do with his or her money. Quote, "They may not have reached a decision about that, but they have for sure thought about it. The pledge that we're asking them to make will put them to thinking about the whole issue again." He warns, most of all, against the rich delaying the decision of what to do with their money. Quote, "If they wait until they're making a final will in their 90s, the chance of their brain power and willpower being better than they are today is nil." Bill Gates regards the 50% as a low bar, encouraging high participation. People, he thinks, may be drawn in by that proportion and then surprise themselves and find that they are giving at higher levels. Quote, "This is about moving to a different realm," he thinks, and it will take time for everything to sort out. Melinda Gates separates the near term from the far. There are so many reasons that rich people don't give, she says. They don't want to plan for their death. They worry that they'll need to hire someone to help with the work. They just don't want to take the time to think about it all. So the initial goal of the pledge campaign, she thinks, must be simply to cut through that and get them moving in the direction of giving. And eventually, quote, 3 to 5 years down the road, we need to have a significant number of billionaires signed up. That would be success. Society cannot help but be a beneficiary here, by virtue of at least some dollars and perhaps many. Nor will it be just the very rich who will perhaps bend their minds to what a pledge of this kind means. It could also be others with less to give, but suddenly more reason to think about the rightness of what they do. My Philanthropic Pledge, July 5, 2010, by Warren Buffett.
In 2006, I made a commitment to gradually give away all of my Berkshire Hathaway stock to philanthropic foundations. I couldn't be happier with that decision. Now, Bill and Melinda Gates and I are asking hundreds of rich Americans to pledge at least 50% of their wealth to charity. So I think it is fitting that I reiterate my intentions and explain the thinking that lies behind them. First, my pledge. More than 99% of my wealth will go to philanthropy during my lifetime or at death. Measured by dollars, this commitment is large. In a comparative sense, though, many individuals give more to others every day. Millions of people who regularly contribute to churches, schools, and other organizations thereby relinquish the use of funds that would otherwise benefit their own families. The dollars these people drop into a collection plate or give to United Way mean foregone movies, dinners out, or other personal pleasures. In contrast, my family and I will give up nothing we need or want by fulfilling this 99% pledge. Moreover, this pledge does not leave me contributing the most precious asset, which is time. Many people, including, I am proud to say, my 3 children, give extensively of their own time and talents to help others. Gifts of this kind often prove far more valuable than money. A struggling child, befriended and nurtured by a caring mentor, receives a gift whose value far exceeds what can be bestowed by a check. My sister Doris extends significant person-to-person help daily. I've done little of this. What I can do, however, is to take a pile of Berkshire Hathaway stock certificates, claim checks, that when converted to cash can command far-ranging resources, and commit them to benefit others who, through the luck of the draw, have received the short straws in life. To date, about 20% of my shares have been distributed, including shares given by my late wife, Susan Buffett. I will continue to annually distribute about 4% of the shares I retain. At the latest, the proceeds from all of my Berkshire shares will be expended for philanthropy purposes by 10 years after my estate is settled. Nothing will go to endowments. I want the money spent on current needs. This pledge will leave my lifestyle untouched and that of my children as well. They have already received significant sums for their personal use and will receive more in the future. They live comfortable and productive lives, and I will continue to live in a manner that gives me everything that I could possibly want in life. Some material things make my life more enjoyable. Many, however, would not. I like having an expensive private plane, but owning a half-dozen homes would be a burden. Too often, a vast collection of possessions ends up possessing its owner. The asset I most value, aside from health, is interesting, diverse, and long-standing friends. My wealth has come from a combination of living in America, some lucky genes, and compound interest. Both my children and I won what I call the ovarian lottery. For starters, the odds against my 1930 birth taking place in the U.S. were at least 30-1. My being male and white also removed huge obstacles that a majority of Americans then faced. My luck was accentuated by my living in a market system that sometimes produces distorted results, though overall, it serves our country well. I worked in an economy that rewards someone who saves the lives of others on a battlefield with a medal, rewards a great teacher with thank you notes from parents, but rewards those who can detect the mispricing of securities with sums reaching into the billions. In short, fate's distribution of long straws is wildly capricious. The reaction of my family and me to our extraordinary good fortune is not guilt, but rather gratitude. Were we to use more than 1% of my claim checks on ourselves, neither our happiness nor our well-being would be enhanced. In contrast, that remaining 99% can have a huge effect on the health and welfare of others. That reality sets an obvious course for me and my family. Keep all we can conceivably need, and distribute the rest to society for its needs. My pledge starts us down that course.
A New Buffett Takes Beijing, October 17, 2011, by Bill Powell. The kids are all right, said a 2010 movie. The same line works for Warren Buffett's 3 kids, Susie, 59, Howard, 57, and Peter, 54. Graduates of Omaha's public schools and familiar from an early age with their parents' strong opinions about not giving it all to the children, they long ago grew up to be solid citizens with careers of their own. True, all 3 today run foundations funded with their parents' money, an occupational niche reserved for the privileged. But the 3 attack that work seriously, knowing the job of giving away money wisely to be extraordinarily hard. Susie's foundation has primarily supported early education in Omaha, where she lives. Howard, who works a farm outside his Decatur, Illinois home, has focused on bettering the lives of Africa's rural poor. And New Yorkers Peter and his wife Jennifer have sought to improve the lot of women around the world. Peter Buffett became the subject of the Fortune article reprinted here because of the smashing Chinese success of his 2010 book, Life is What You Make It. Translations of the book had sold 320,000 copies in China, where this article was published, and the count in mid-2012 was up to 400,000. Warren Buffett's reputation in China clearly didn't hurt. He is known there as the god of stocks, and his every move is catalogued. But something about Peter's dropping out of prestigious Stanford and going off, without loads of money, to pursue an uncertain career, well, that grabbed the minds of China's young people, many of them unable to imagine how he could possibly have taken that risk. Howard Buffett is right now writing a book, set to be published in 2013, about his tumbling into a farming career and later becoming an expert on Africa's agricultural challenges. Susie Buffett is not writing a book, not now at least. From her post in Omaha, she is the family's most effective communicator with her father about all things important, say, personal security systems. Warren has no patience for their details nor even their existence. Susie takes over, and the security job gets done. C.L.
It is, and this is putting it mildly, sometimes difficult to generalize about a nation of 1.3 billion people. But let's go out on a limb and say there aren't many who would quibble with the description of China as money-obsessed. This is a nation in which, arguably, the most important phrase ever attributed to its transformational leader, Deng Xiaoping, was to get rich is glorious. In China, they call Warren Buffett the god of stocks. And whenever he visits, the Chinese media cover his every move and utterance. There have been over 40 books about Warren Buffett translated into Chinese, which makes it very interesting that Peter Buffett, Warren's unassuming 53-year-old son, has recently become a rising star in China in his own right. It's not because everyone thinks Warren's investment acumen has been handed down via DNA. Peter Buffett is a successful musician and a composer, writing scores for television and film. The Dances with Wolves soundtrack is one of his prominent credits, and performing his new-agey music in concert. He played most recently in August at Beijing Tanglewood, a gorgeous new outdoor concert space in the shadow of the Great Wall. But Beijing isn't exactly Marin County. In today's China, New Age music will take you only so far. The reason Buffett has piqued the interest of a lot of Chinese, students and young professionals in particular, is that he has taken to dispensing life advice along with his music. And if part of his core message, in essence that money isn't everything, seems rather counterintuitive in China these days, that's precisely the reason he has struck a chord. Warren Buffett's rock star status tells us something about what China is today. Peter's success might tell us something about where it's going. Earlier this year, a publisher in Beijing decided to capitalize on the Chinese demand for all things Buffett and translate a book Peter had written in 2010 titled Life is What You Make It. Find Your Own Path to Fulfillment. It sold modestly in the U.S. and was released in China in March, carrying the Chinese title Be Yourself. By the end of August, the book had sold 320,000 copies, a huge number even in a country of 1.3 billion. Through much of the spring and summer, says Zhang Haiyou, editor-in-chief of New World Press, Buffett's Chinese publisher, they were selling 1,000 copies a day online. We obviously had hoped for the best, but honestly, we were stunned, says Zhang. Buffett did a 4-city promotional tour this past spring in which, as he often does in the States, he paired his music with his message. Concert and Conversation, the events are called. He did 25 press interviews with the electronic and printed media, national and local, including a web chat on what, for students and young professionals, has become the most important media site of them all, Sina.com's microblog, the Chinese version of Twitter. It was only his second visit to China, and though he was aware of his father's status in the country, he hadn't quite grasped the magnitude of it. Sitting in a Beijing hotel in August, a day before his Great Wall concert, Buffett says he was taken aback by the intensity of the reception. It wasn't quite what I was expecting, he says, laughing. It was like a presidential campaign or something. There were reporters everywhere. You have to remember that while Peter Andrew Buffett may be the second son of the god of stocks and the late Susan Buffett, his mother died in 2004, he is not used to the star treatment. Far from it, in fact. He and his wife, Jennifer, have a place in New York City, but spend much of their time in quiet Ulster County, New York, 90 miles north of the city. The couple have no children. In addition to pursuing his music career, he, like his two older siblings, runs his own charitable foundation, which his father has funded generously with Berkshire Hathaway stock. His sister Susie still lives in Omaha and focuses on her philanthropic work. His brother Howard owns a farm in Decatur, Illinois. Above all, the key thing about Peter Buffett is that he appears to be absolutely and completely normal. It hardly seems possible, but there it is. Well-grounded, affable, nary a twitch of neuroses or insecurity about him. "Oh yeah," he says, "I get that all the time. You're Warren Buffett's son, and you're so normal." Audiences everywhere are inevitably curious as to how exactly that came to be. But in China, the curiosity is off the charts. One of the things Buffett likes to remind audiences of is that when he was growing up, long before Dad became America's economic oracle, advisor to presidents, and writer of op-eds reassuring a depressed nation that all was not lost, his father was a supremely successful but largely anonymous investor. He was a regular guy who was known and revered only by the kind of folks who go to sleep with a copy of Graham and Dodd under their pillow. And he's basically the same guy now. The curiosity in China is fed by the fact that when Peter's father announced he was giving away his considerable wealth to a foundation run by another supremely rich guy, Bill Gates, a lot of folks there had a single thought: why would he do that to his kids? Mostly lost in translation was the fact that the elder Buffett was acting in accordance with his long-articulated position that he would give his kids enough money so that they would feel they could do anything, but not so much that they could do nothing. But curiosity alone wouldn't have resulted in the sale of 320,000 books. Something about Buffett's message is definitely resonating with many young Chinese, says Zhang, his editor. That message is inextricable from Peter's biography. He tells audiences that from the time he can remember, he always loved music. "My mother said I sang before I spoke," he told an interviewer for CCTV last spring. His dad has been known to play a little ukulele. A good student, he got into Stanford University, but was not particularly career-focused or interested in Graham and Dodd. "For the first year and a half of college," he says, "I took everything that ended in 101 or ology. Then, and here is where a young Chinese audience leans in, not quite believing what they are hearing, he dropped out. He decided that he wanted to pursue a career in music. It was right in front of my nose my whole life," he says. "So he took a small inheritance from my grandfather, bought an apartment in San Francisco, and tried to make a go of it. And his parents," he tells most stunned audiences, "were fine with it. They were encouraging, but also made it clear that if you blow it, well, good luck," says Buffett. Within 2 years, he was confident he'd made the right choice. "By then, I knew I could make a living in music." The point Buffett repeats in all his appearances in China is that by quitting Stanford and trying to make a go of it in music, he was doing the same thing his father did. "My father knew early on what he loved to do, and he did it. And he's doing it to this day," he says. "So I tell audiences in China that my father and I do, in fact, do the same thing for a living. We both do what we love." To American ears, this can sound trite. The cynic says, "Okay, come on. It's a lot easier to do whatever you want to do if Warren Buffett is your dad." But that's not how most Chinese audiences react. Most audiences in China are gobsmacked, and for reasons that are perfectly understandable. The outside world sees China as a rising economic power, a nation with seemingly irreversible economic momentum. That may be true enough, but for all its gaudy economic statistics, on the inside, the country is also an economic pressure cooker. Children with aspirations for college put in 14 to 18 hours a day studying, desperate to get accepted to a good university, if they get in. they have to pick a major early. They're on an up escalator, which, true enough, is better than not being on one, and they can't get off. If a student graduates and lands a desirable job, he or she often doesn't get paid particularly well and has to put in long hours. To top it off, many of today's younger workers are children of China's one-child policy, which means that they alone are responsible for taking care of their parents when they retire. In short, says Edward Bell, an executive at Ogilvy and Mather in Shanghai, who has studied the 20-something Chinese in depth, this is a generation that has to sprint just to stay even. I call it Generation Stress. It's precisely that angst that Peter Buffett taps into. That's why Tianli Feng, like a lot of Chinese young professionals, isn't particularly surprised by its success. He graduated from business school a year ago in Beijing, a finance major who now works for the Bank of Communications in China, a large state-owned bank. A big fan of Peter's father. I think I've read all the books about him, he says. He went to see Peter Buffett speak this past spring, not quite knowing what to expect. I was touched, he says, particularly when he spoke about leaving Stanford to pursue his music. Shaking his head, he adds, such a prestigious school. Buffett understands that the experiences he writes about and the impulses that drove his career are uniquely American. He is also self-effacing and secure enough to acknowledge that if his name were Smith or Jones, no one in China would be interested. But China, novice or not, when he says that, it seems as if this place is moving at such light speed that a lot of young people don't get a chance to have a second thought. He's right. I don't think my parents would ever let me do what he did, says Tian, the banker. But maybe someday, he adds softly, my own child can have that choice. If so, Peter might leave as rich a legacy in China as his dad.
A Nation Grapples with Charity, October 17, 2011. A sidebar by Bill Powell.
Last year, Warren Buffett and Bill Gates visited Beijing for what they thought would be the least controversial of reasons. They had arranged to have a private dinner with a group of rich, successful Chinese businessmen and to talk with them about a subject that seemed innocuous, philanthropy. The Chinese blogosphere caught wind of the dinner and erupted in chatter. And not all of it, acknowledges Peter Buffett, was positive. That's putting it mildly. The subject of rich folks giving away their money to charity might be uncontroversial in the United States, but in China, it's not. In fact, Peter says, when he comes to China to perform and speak to groups of students and young professionals, the subject of second-generation wealth always comes up. They always want to talk about it. There are two reasons philanthropy gets people riled up in China. First, a fair number of rich folks there believe giving it away is antithetical to Chinese values, which stress family above all. It's why some Chinese were upset when they heard, mistakenly, that Buffett and Gates were coming to tell rich Chinese how to give away their wealth. Many young Chinese were stunned when Buffett said he was giving most of his wealth to the Gates Foundation. But the second reason wealthy Chinese haven't been racing to donate more of their money, particularly this year, is less obvious. Charitable foundations in China are dogged by the whiff, and sometimes more than that, of corruption. Management fees for charities in China are often up to 10% of donations collected, compared with around 3% in the West. Earlier this year, the mere photograph on the web of a young woman identified as a manager of the Red Cross in China sent the blogosphere into a frenzy. The reason? The photo showed her driving a fancy car and carrying a Hermes purse. The agency insisted that the woman in question did not, in fact, work for the Red Cross in China. She was the girlfriend of what the agency murkily called a business partner. The denials didn't matter. Donations to RCIC in the first half of 2011 plummeted and, according to some Chinese press reports, slowed considerably to the charitable sector as a whole. That pointed to the lack of trust that extends to the charitable sector in China. Several prominent Chinese businessmen and philanthropists, led by Cao Dewang, owner of one of the largest glassmaking companies in China, have now publicly insisted that the domestic charities they donate to have to become more transparent and cost-effective. This doesn't have anything to do with values, Western or Chinese, Cao has said. To increase charity now in China is a matter of trust.
Why Stocks Beat Gold and Bonds. February 27, 2012. An excerpt from Buffett's letter to shareholders in the 2011 Berkshire Hathaway Annual Report. Gold is a barren asset. Bonds are seldom rewarding to investors. Well-chosen productive assets like common stocks and land are the logical prospects to deliver superior returns. Those are the messages of the article that follows, which is an excerpt, carrying a Fortune title, from Warren Buffett's letter in Berkshire's 2011 Annual Report. Those are also the principles by which Buffett has led his investing life. So this piece seems a perfect way to close the book on our 46-year Buffett expedition, this business biography as played out in the pages of Fortune. But we need also to add up what Buffett has accomplished, both as investor and businessman, in those 46 years. In 1966, he was the proprietor of an unfamous hedge fund, Buffett Partnership Limited, and the controlling shareholder and de facto CEO of a small New England textile company, Berkshire Hathaway, with $49 million in annual revenues. By 2011, Berkshire was number 7 in the Fortune 500, with $144 billion in revenues. That leap, largely unrecognized, even Buffett was surprised to learn he had the distinction about to be noted, is extraordinary. No other man has within his lifetime taken a company from obscurity to the top 10 of the 500. Buffett would say that doesn't matter much, revenues not being that important. Market value is something he respects much more, and for 2011, Berkshire ranked 9th in the 500, with $202 billion. Soaring in front of that measurement was another company built by one man in his lifetime, the late Steve Jobs of Apple, a company whose market value was at the same point a colossal $569 billion. The two men had gotten to know each other decades ago, when both were members of the Grinnell College Board. They talked rarely after that, but Buffett just happens to remember that once, not too long ago, Jobs called to ask about ideas for dealing with Apple's excess cash, and then went away and did nothing that Buffett had suggested. That hedge fund in Buffett's life, Buffett Partnership Limited, disappeared long ago, closed at the end of 1969 because Buffett could not stomach the speculation that had entered the market. But the $100 million it then had in investments was the seed, so to speak, of $86 billion in equity investments that Berkshire had a few months ago in June. Buffett's big stakes were spread across the American economy. Berkshire then had $15.6 billion in Coca-Cola, $13.7 billion in Wells Fargo, $13 billion in IBM, and $8.8 billion in American Express. In 2012, all of Berkshire's financial feats were overshadowed by two pieces of Buffett news. First, a bit earlier in August 2011, the New York Times ran an op-ed Buffett had written under the headline, "Stop Coddling the Rich." Buffett compared the low tax rate he was paying, 17%, to the rates of the 20 other people in his office, 33%, to 41%, and called for tax increases for anyone earning more than $1 million. In the election year of 2012, the Obama administration both embraced and expanded that proposition, backing a Buffett rule, immediately and hugely controversial, of course, that would impose higher taxes on everyone with taxable income above $250,000. Cracked Buffett, I always wanted to have a tax named after me. In the second news item, Buffett announced by press release on April 17th that he had been diagnosed with stage 1 prostate cancer, a label denoting, among other specifics, a cancer that has not spread outside the prostate gland. As I write this in mid-September, Buffett has just completed 2 months of radiation at an Omaha hospital. During this treatment, he experienced the fatigue that normally accompanies it and consequently elected on some days to work from home. Buffett, now 82, has every confidence that he will survive this disease and live for many more years to come, as a high percentage of men having it do, and that it will not, for more than a very brief time, interfere with his tap dancing to work. C.L.
Investing is often described as the process of laying out money now in the expectation of receiving more money in the future. At Berkshire Hathaway, we take a more demanding approach, defining investing as the transfer to others of purchasing power now, with the reasoned expectations of receiving more purchasing power after taxes have been paid on nominal gains in the future. More succinctly, investing is foregoing consumption now in order to have the ability to consume more at a later date. From our definition, there flows an important corollary. The riskiness of an investment is not measured by beta, a Wall Street term encompassing volatility and often used in measuring risk, but rather by the probability, the reasoned probability, of that investment causing its owner a loss of purchasing power over his contemplated holding period. Assets can fluctuate greatly in price and not be risky as long as they are reasonably certain to deliver increased purchasing power over their holding period. And, as we will see, a non-fluctuating asset can be laden with risk. Investment possibilities are both many and varied. There are 3 categories, however, and it's important to understand the characteristics of each. So, let's survey the field. Investments that are denominated in a given currency include money market funds, bonds, mortgages, bank deposits, and other investments. Most of these currency-based investments are thought of as safe. In truth, they are among the most dangerous of assets. Their beta may be 0, but their risk is huge. Over the past century, these instruments have destroyed the purchasing power of investors in many countries, even as these holders continue to receive timely payments of interest and principal. This ugly result, moreover, will forever recur. Governments determine the ultimate value of money, and systemic forces will sometimes cause them to gravitate to policies that produce inflation. From time to time, such policies spin out of control. Even in the U.S., where the wish for a stable currency is strong, the dollar has fallen a staggering 86% in value since 1965, when I took over the management of Berkshire. It takes no less than $7 today to buy what $1 did at that time. Consequently, a tax-free institution would have needed 4.3% interest annually from bond investments over that period to simply maintain its purchasing power. Its managers would have been kidding themselves if they thought of any portion of that interest as income. For tax-paying investors like you and me, the picture has been far worse. During the same 47-year period, continuous rolling of U.S. Treasury bills produced 5.7% annually. That sounds satisfactory. But if an individual investor paid personal income taxes at a rate averaging 25%, This 5.7 return would have yielded nothing in the way of real income. This investor's visible income tax would have stripped him of 1.4 points of the stated yield, and the invisible inflation tax would have devoured the remaining 4.3 points. It's noteworthy that the implicit inflation tax was more than triple the explicit income tax that our investor probably thought of as his main burden. In God we trust may be imprinted on our currency, but the hand that activates our government's printing press has been all too human. High interest rates, of course, can compensate purchasers for the inflation risk they face with currency-based investments, and indeed rates in the early 1980s did that job nicely. Current rates, however, do not come close to offsetting the purchasing power risks that investors assume. Right now, bonds should come with a warning label. Under today's conditions, therefore, I do not like currency-based investments. Even so, Berkshire holds significant amounts of them, primarily of the short-term variety. At Berkshire, the need for ample liquidity occupies center stage and will never be slighted, however inadequate rates may be. Accommodating this need, we primarily hold U.S. Treasury bills, the only investment that can be counted on for liquidity under the most chaotic of economic conditions. Our working level for liquidity is $20 billion. $10 billion is our absolute minimum. Beyond the requirements that liquidity and regulators impose on us, we will purchase currency-related securities only if they offer the possibility of unusual gain, either because a particular credit is mispriced, as can occur in periodic junk bond debacles, or because rates rise to a level that offers the possibility of realizing substantial capital gains on high-grade bonds when rates fall. Though we've exploited both opportunities in the past and may do so again, we are now 180 degrees removed from such prospects. Today, a wry comment that Wall Streeter Shelby Cullum Davis made long ago seems apt. Bonds, promoted as offering risk-free returns, are now priced to deliver return-free risk. The second major category of investments involves assets that will never produce anything, but are purchased in the buyer's hope that someone else, who also knows that the assets will be forever unproductive, will pay more for them in the future. Tulips, of all things, briefly became a favorite of such buyers in the 17th century. This type of investment requires an expanding pool of buyers who, in turn, are enticed because they believe the buying pool will expand still further. Owners are not inspired by what the asset itself can produce, it will remain lifeless forever, but rather by the belief that others will desire it even more avidly in the future. The major asset in this category is gold, currently a huge favorite of investors who fear almost all other assets, especially paper money, of whose value, as noted, they are right to be fearful. Gold, however, has two significant shortcomings, being neither of much use nor procreative. True, gold has some industrial and decorative utility, but the demand for these purposes is both limited and incapable of soaking up new production. Meanwhile, if you own 1 ounce of gold for an eternity, you will still own 1 ounce at its end. What motivates most gold purchasers is their belief that the ranks of the fearful will grow. During the past decade, that belief has proved correct. Beyond that, the rising price has, on its own, generated additional buying enthusiasm, attracting purchasers who see the rise as validating an investment thesis. As bandwagon investors join any party, they create their own truth, for a while. Over the past 15 years, both internet stocks and houses have demonstrated the extraordinary excesses that can be created by combining an initially sensible thesis with well-publicized rising prices. In these bubbles, the army of originally skeptical investors succumbed to the proof delivered by the market, and the pool of buyers, for a time, expanded sufficiently to keep the bandwagon rolling. But bubbles blown large enough inevitably pop. And then the old proverb is confirmed once again: what the wise man does in the beginning, the fool does in the end. Today, the world's gold stock is up about 170,000 metric tons. If all this gold were melded together, it would form a cube of about 68 feet per side. Picture it fitting comfortably within a baseball infield. At $1,750 per ounce, gold's price, as I write this, its value would be about $9.6 trillion. Call this cube Pile A. Let's now create a Pile B, costing an equal amount. For that, we could buy all U.S. cropland, 400 million acres with output of about $200 billion annually, plus 16 ExxonMobils, the world's most profitable company, one earning more than $40 billion annually. After these purchases, we would have about $1 trillion left over for walking around money. No sense feeling strapped after this buying binge. Can you imagine an investor with $9.6 trillion selecting Pile A over Pile B? Beyond the staggering valuation given the existing stock of gold, current prices make today's annual production of gold command about $160 billion. Buyers, whether jewelry and industrial users, frightened individuals, or speculators, must continually absorb this additional supply to merely maintain an equilibrium at present prices. A century from now, the 400 million acres of farmland will have produced staggering amounts of corn, wheat, cotton, and other crops, and will continue to produce that valuable bounty, whatever the currency may be. ExxonMobil will probably have delivered trillions of dollars in dividends to its owners and will also hold assets worth many more trillions. And remember, you get 16 Exxons. The 170,000 tons of gold will be unchanged in size and still incapable of producing anything. You can fondle the cube, but it will not respond. Admittedly, when people a century from now are fearful, it's likely many will still rush to gold. I'm confident, however, that the $9.6 trillion current valuation of Pile A will compound over the century at a rate far inferior to that achieved by Pile B. Our first two categories enjoy maximum popularity at peaks of fear. Terror over economic collapse drives individuals to currency-based assets, most particularly U.S. obligations, and fear of currency collapse fosters movement to sterile assets such as gold. We heard cash is king in late 2008, just when cash should have been deployed rather than held. Similarly, we heard cash is trash in the early 1980s, just when fixed dollar investments were at their most attractive level in memory. On those occasions, investors who required a supportive crowd paid dearly for that comfort. My own preference, and you knew this was coming, is our third category: investment in productive assets, whether businesses, farms, or real estate. Ideally, these assets should have the ability in inflationary times to deliver output that will retain its purchasing power value while requiring a minimum of new capital investment. Farms, real estate, and many businesses such as Coca-Cola, IBM, and our own See's Candy meet that double-barreled test. Certain other companies, think of our regulated utilities for example, fail it because inflation places heavy capital requirements on them. To earn more, their owners must invest more. Even so, these investments will remain superior to non-productive or currency-based assets. Whether the currency a century from now is based on gold, seashells, shark teeth, or a piece of paper, as today, people will be willing to exchange a couple of minutes of their daily labor for a Coca-Cola or some See's peanut brittle. In the future, the U.S. population will move more goods, consume more food, and require more living space than it does now. People will forever exchange what they produce for what others produce. Our country's businesses will continue to efficiently deliver goods and services wanted by our citizens. Metaphorically, these commercial cows will live for centuries and give ever greater quantities of milk to boot. Their value will be determined not by the medium of exchange, but rather by their capacity to deliver milk. Proceeds from the sale of milk will compound for the owners of the cows just as they did during the 20th century when the Dow increased from 66 to 11,497 and paid loads of dividends as well. Berkshire's goal will be to increase its ownership of first-rate businesses. Our first choice will be to own them in their entirety, but we will also be owners by way of holding sizable amounts of marketable stocks. I believe that over any extended period of time, this category of investing will prove to be the runaway winner among the three we've examined. More important, it will be by far the safest.
Final note from the editor. When Fortune first mentioned Warren Buffett in 1966, Berkshire's stock, today's Class A, was about $22. In mid-September 2012, it was $133,000. CL.